Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. March 9, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Tyson joins DX. Record ratings. By Observer staff. Mike Tyson joined Degeneration X. WCW countered with this week's version of the greatest tag team match in history. Undertaker returned. Bret Hart wrestled on television for the first time in more than 4 months, and the combined Monday night audience set another all-time record on March 2nd. But with all that was new, there was also the same old, WCW ending a much-hyped match with the same sorry run-in finish, which is still a step ahead of WWF advertising a main event match all week involving Steve Austin and again not delivering. WCW sold out the Core State Spectrum in Philadelphia, but the audience was the hardest and deadest for a Nitro in a long time. WCW tried a closed-circuit telecast next door at the Core State Center which flopped. WWF sold out the Gund Arena in Cleveland and had a rabid crowd throughout. But even with the heavy hype of Tyson, still lost the ratings by a full point, and more importantly, got no mainstream ink out of doing a major angle with Tyson, showing that the media has tired of the Tyson as wrestling character story. There were things which worked for the live crowd but not in the ratings, Undertaker's return, things which worked for the ratings but not the live crowd, Bret Hart wrestling in the Dream Tag Team match, and some of which worked for both, Tyson, an NWO angle involving the Steiners and giant power-bombing Kevin Nash, and everything that Ric Flair touched. The combined rating set an all-time record, with Nitro getting its second highest rating in history in a competitive situation, a 4.81 rating, 4.83 first hour, 4.68 seconds hour, 4.93 third hour, and 7.42 share. Raw also got its second highest rating in a competitive situation, a 3.80 rating, 3.90 first hour, 3.70 seconds hour, and 5.80 share. The combined rating for the head-to-head 2 hours was a record-setting 8.60 or 6,250,000 homes. The 10 to 10:15 p.m. segment, in which both groups did 4.5 ratings, Nitro slightly edged Raw with 3,267,000 homes to 3,259,000 homes, with Raw having the Tyson angle and Nitro having Jim Duggan vs. Scott Steiner, and the Nitro Girls and Mean Gene Go to College drew a combined 9.0 rating and 6,526,000 homes, both all-time records for Monday Night Wrestling. Tyson came to the ring wearing jeans and a WWF t-shirt, to thunderous boos. Vince McMahon, who introduced him, seemed stunned and embarrassed by the reception, by the way he was dressed and the limo gimmick and handlers. The boos were clearly the desired and expected reaction. Before he could say a word, Shawn Michaels, Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Chyna came out. Michaels challenged Tyson and both told everyone to get out of the ring. After much posturing, Michaels went to punch Tyson, but instead ripped his WWF t-shirt off, revealing a DX t-shirt, and they all posed in the ring together. Tyson appeared to be having the time of his life and at this stage probably fits better in wrestling than boxing anyway. They did a backstage interview with Tyson's camp and DX together. Due to the hotter crowd and the Tyson angle, Raw was the better show of the two even though it came up short in the ratings as always. However, unlike the first angle with Austin in the press conference, this angle got virtually no mainstream acknowledgement outside of Japan, almost as if the media basically has done its Tyson sinking so low as to do wrestling's story and it's no longer a story, which doesn't bode well for WrestleMania. The general feeling is that in today's climate, you can't force someone to be a babyface that the public doesn't want to be one initially. So Tyson is made a heel in Fantasyland just like he is in real Fantasyland, to set up acceptance of him when the big turn comes. If Tyson is working more than just Mania, the turn doesn't necessarily have to come at Mania. For someone suffering from an allegedly severe back injury, Michaels showed no sign of stiffness of movement while in front of the public and looked physically to be in the same condition he's always in. The injury was never mentioned on television. Michaels underwent his third cortisone shot to his herniated disc 5 days earlier. The Austin K non-match saw Austin go to the ring, but while still on the ramp, went after Helmsley and was suckered with a superkick by Michaels and sold it like he'd been shot. Austin got up and went to the back, leaving Kane in the ring, and he never came out for the main event that had been pushed hard on television for 1 week. As Paul Bearer was doing an interview proclaiming Undertaker as dead, and Kane was choke-slamming a small planted fan and tombstoning timekeeper Mark Eaton, taking his first bump since the Shawn Michaels superkick 2 years ago at WrestleMania. Finally Undertaker's music played for a while. Eventually a coffin was brought out, a lightning bolt hit the coffin, and Undertaker arose from the dead, talking about visiting his dead parents, as opposed to his alive parents that he was actually spending time with. while he was gone and challenging Kane to the WrestleMania match. The Nitro main event with Sting and Randy Savage vs. Hulk Hogan and Scott Hall, hyped as the first time WCW and NWO joined forces as part of a tag team, wound up with almost no heat once they were in the ring. No attention being given to the Sting-Hall program, as Hall might as well have been as invisible next to Hogan as Francine is next to Sunny, as Hogan and Savage have become the total focal point of WCW. But the crowd really didn't seem to care much for Savage either, and reacted to Hogan as a star for his entrances and his interview, but not to him much in the ring. It ended up with Sting getting the Scorpion on Hogan and the NWO run-in for the DQ in 7/29. Earlier, Hart had his first television match in WCW, beating Bryan Adams via DQ when Curt Hennig interfered in 4/31. The crowd reaction to both had to be terribly disappointing. The reaction to Hart and Adams was almost silence, and the main event, despite how hot Savage and Hogan have been in most cities, wasn't a whole lot better. Sting and Savage in coming out together got little reaction except tepid booing. To build up the match, they had Sting and Savage out together doing an interview, and when Sting talked at length for the first time on television in 18 months, the crowd booed him lightly and he got virtually no cheers at all. However, both segments did 5.3 ratings, with the Hart-Adams match and angle that preceded it with the NWO acting like they were bringing in Rick Steiner. Rick Steiner acting like he was accepting the NWO t-shirt, and then Steiner clocked Kevin Nash before getting destroyed by the entire NWO, leading to Giant coming out and powerbombing Nash to leave him laying. That segment destroyed Raw, which had a Paul Bearer rant and the Michaels Austin angle doing a 3.1, and the tag main event's 5.3 easily outdistanced Raw's 3.6 for The Undertaker's return. Raw drew its largest audience early, awaiting Tyson, although there was a break in those large numbers when the NWA came out. Once Tyson did his angle, the audience dropped 20% and Nitro took over. Nitro's audience was steady for most of the first head-to-head 90 minutes except a huge jump for the Conan vs. Super Colo match, Ric Flair, Curt Hennig interview and angle, and I hope people don't think it's too presumptuous to credit it to the latter. There were two other segments that were somewhat close, with WCW holding a 4.6 to 4.2 lead for a music video that involved Diamond Dallas Page and Raven's Flock, a Page interview and a Page vs. Hammer match against New Age Outlaws vs. DOA and Chainsaw and Cactus Run-In, and 4.4 to 4.2 for a Bret Hart interview and Bulldog vs. Scott Norton against Mero vs. Brandy and Owen Hart vs. Mark Henry. Nitro had sold out the Spectrum well in advance, with 14,254 paying $236,978. Due to the late rush of interest due to the tag team main event, they tried an experiment of opening up the Core State Center for the overflow, which was a failure due to it not being known to anyone until 2 days before and the show being on free television, drawing 1,708 fans at $10 per head, and the show did another $159,500 in merchandise. The original plan was to show footage from the Core State Spectrum to show how big Nitro had become that they had booked a second building for the overflow, but for obvious reasons, mention of the closed circuit was toned down during the broadcast and there was no footage. Raw in Cleveland sold out the Gund Arena with 15,643 paying $252,393 and another $189,108 in merchandise. Several major names from Shoot Sports, among them arguably the single greatest wrestler who has ever lived, are among the list circulated as being rumored or confirmed in regards to retirement matches of two of the biggest name pro wrestlers in the history of Japan. Former decorated Soviet wrestler Igor Mindert, former UFC champion Don Frye, and former UFC competitors Dave Beneteau and Brian Johnston are all part of the 8-man tournament to determine the final opponent for Antonio Inoki on the April 4th Tokyo Dome show. But those names pale in comparison to that of Alexander Karelin, without question the single most dominant athlete in the history of Greco-Roman wrestling, who is apparently in negotiations to make his pro wrestling debut in September as the final opponent for Akira Maeda. Karelin 30, the 6'3", 286-pound Russian known as the Experiment, and obviously that nickname didn't come from his use of creatine or HMB, captured gold medals in the 1988, 1992 and 1996 Olympics as a super heavyweight in Greco-Roman wrestling. Not only is Karelin believed to have been undefeated since the age of 17, but for years his dominance of the sport was such that it wasn't even believed until the past year or two that there was anyone in the entire sport who could give his winning streak a serious test. In recent years his margins of victory have closed down to the point where it is conceivable one of the top world-class wrestlers could at least threaten the streak, as Matt Gaffari of the United States lost a close decision to him in the Atlanta Olympic Finals. Karelin's name hasn't been publicly announced in Japan in regard to being Maeda's final opponent. During this past week, Rings held a press conference announcing that Maeda would face a major superstar in his retirement match in September, but the actual date, site, and opponent weren't mentioned. However, it has leaked out that Karelin is the opponent they are trying to sign. In past years, both the WWF and UFC in its early days had set their sights on Karelin, although how serious each company truly approached the idea is unknown, but UFC talked in its early days about Karelin extensively. Besides announcing that the semifinals and finals of the tournament for Inoki's final opponent, along with the winner versus Inoki as the main feature on the card, New Japan also this week announced 3 title matches and one more bout for the April 4th Tokyo Dome show. Due to Inoki's retirement and ticket prices being raised and a sellout crowd expected, it could be the largest live gate in the history of pro wrestling. The lackluster matches have Kensuke Sasaki defending the IWGP Heavyweight title against Tatsumi Fujinami. 2 weeks before the match, the two are scheduled as partners in a tag match main event on the March 22 Nagoya show. Keiji Muto and Masahiro Chono defending the IWGP Tag Team titles against Shinya Hashimoto and Osamu Nishimura, and Jushin Liger defending the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title against Kendo Kashin, and a tag match with Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto versus Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Yuji Yasurioka, formerly with the now-defunct War Promotion, which has minor interest since Takaiwa has been working for months as part of a tag team with Kanemoto and Otani. The tournament will have its first round matches on March 22 at Nagoya Aichi Gym. The first of the 4 tourney bouts that night will have Kazuyuki Fujita, a New Japan prelim wrestler who was last year's Japanese Pro Wrestling Rookie of the Year, a former national champion in amateur wrestling, facing Mindert, 6'8", flabby 286-pound former Russian freestyle wrestling super heavyweight champion. Mindert did what looked to be somewhat of a suspicious but poor match on the October 11th Valley Tudo show, but on by KRS at the Tokyo Dome in his Japanese debut, being much smaller Hiroki Kurosawa. Fry, whose New Japan contract has been extended through September, which means he won't be back in UFC until that time, if ever, faces Kazuo Yamazaki in a rematch of a bout Fry won on November 2nd at the Fukuoka Dome. Johnston, a former UFC fighter with a good look, faces veteran shooter Yoshiaki Fujiwara. Johnston, who is training with Brad Rheingans in Minnesota for pro wrestling both in Japan and possibly WCW, and has done one major pro wrestling match putting over Naoya Ogawa on September 23 at Budokan Hall. The final first-round match has Ogawa, who it is generally believed will win the tournament, although Inoki did shoot an angle with Fry on February 15 at Budokan, which ended up making the front cover of both major weeklies, against Beneto, a UFC veteran who did one pro wrestling match for UWFI in 1996, putting over Yoji Anjo at a major baseball stadium show in Tokyo. As mentioned, New Japan and Inoki were having trouble putting together the tournament, as few big-name pro wrestlers wanted to be involved in a deal where they would have to put over either Ogawa or other shooters with far lesser mainstream names. That was mainly an ego stroke for Inoki. Ogawa's athletic fame in Japan from being a 3-time world champion in judo is probably greater than all but a handful of pro wrestling legends. Genichiro Tenryu turned down a spot in the tournament, even though at this point his career is going nowhere. Most of the top New Japan wrestlers, including Hashimoto, who has been doing a lot of so-called mixed matches on recent major shows, wanted nothing to do with this. The best description of ECW's 4th pay-per-view show is some good, some bad, and some creative. The show itself on March 1st at the Asbury Park, New Jersey Convention Center before a sellout crowd of about 3,700 fans, paying $80,000, and most of the matches had this basic theme. The sellout, which actually included some standing room tickets being sold, due to a great walk-up, relieved a scare, as Asbury Park is something of a ghost town, and they only had 1,200 tickets sold 1 week before the show, and still had second-row seats available the day of the show. The show established that even with wrestlers working their butts off, the company simply doesn't have the quality of depth to compete from a wrestling standpoint with even a mid-level WCW pay-per-view, and it doesn't have the quality of headliners or the financial resources to compete with anything better than a mid-level WWF show either. It's a foregone conclusion it can't compete on a show production basis. It can, at least at its best, and from all accounts this show was closer to that level that the previous two compete in terms of crowd reactions, but has yet to master getting that enthusiasm across on television for an entire show. It can compete in storytelling, but in trying so hard to get across its stories, it has sacrificed the credibility of its lone announcer, Joey Styles, to the point that his credibility is quickly, if they don't change pace and pull him out of the quicksand, going to wind up at the level of Gene Okerlund on a 900 line. Doug Furnas is half of the most successful foreign tag team in the history of Japanese wrestling. Yeah, wait until the outcry if Jim Ross were to say that the Headbangers are considered by most experts as the greatest tag team in the long and storied history of the National Wrestling Alliance. Or if Mike Tenay were to have attempted to present Gedo as one of the most decorated athletes in the history of Japan, the exact words ECW used for Wing Kanemura, a wrestler of about the same level, who wasn't even there to begin with. But was it entertaining? If you're an ECW fan, it was, and if you don't like the show, you're probably not going to like most of what ECW offers. With its previous 3 shows, ECW established itself as to what level it stands as a business, a distant but profitable third promotion. The first pay-per-view was among the best pay-per-view shows of the year, but if you take Terry Funk and the Michinoku Pro Wrestlers out of that mix, it would have been an entirely different story. The second and third shows never captured ECW when it is good ECW. With this show, ECW established what it both can and can't do in comparison with how it looks in a competitive environment when it puts on what is by its standards, a representation of good ECW. Guys working as hard, if not harder, but generally not as good. Despite attempting to market them as such, necessary to create stars, there are really no franchises, showstoppers, and shows. Bloodier to be sure. A lot more amateurish performances, see, right, Lance? By people who come off a lot better when edited. And more than its fair share of creativity. But with all the promises of being different, better wrestling and politically incorrect, they brought nothing to the table that the WWF doesn't other than more blood, an impressive balcony leap, and a great ring entrance at the end of the show. Joey Styles desperately needs a broadcast sidekick on these shows, and he's in a bad position in that the more the product is exposed, the more his credibility gets exposed. If they put in a clown to hype it, Styles can do his job without coming across as a transparent shill. They brought out a world-famous hardcore porn star, who was wearing more than Sable usually shows every week on Raw, let alone all the dead women on silk stockings, and whose acting ability makes Sable look like Meryl Streep. You can't brag about how different things are and then have them be exactly the same. Well, of course you can, when you're selling illusion, which is what pro wrestling is based on. Most obvious case in point. After teasing the audience for nearly 2 hours with lures of graphic titillation about how sick the Sabu vs. Sandman match was and why it can't be aired, when it finally was aired, it was tamer than most of the matches that were already on the show. The main event actually delivered less than most Hogan matches, although it wasn't the fault of the wrestlers, as there was a hole in the ring at the time, which only served to make the company look that much less professional. The idea of keeping the hole in the ring, as they never even attempted to fix it as the tape match was airing, was to give the ring-breaking angle more credibility as something that happened not on the script since there were no provisions for it. But can you imagine if they were to do a gimmick on a WWF or WCW pay-per-view show where the ring breaks, that they wouldn't have made provisions for it to be fixed in time for Hogan or Michaels' match, and thus end the show 20 minutes early? Actually, it was timed out to end 10 minutes early to begin with, so it actually, as it was timed out, only ended 10 minutes early. 1. Jerry Lynn and Chris Chetty beat Tracy Smothers and Little Guido, James Stone, in 8:19. Basic tag match, which was a solid house show opener. Chetty is a good athlete, very good for his level of experience as far as polish, but he now needs to work on facials and crowd interaction because athletically he's already among the best in the company. Smothers and Guido are exactly what an opening act tag team should be. Solid work, decent comedy, goofy gimmick but one that is easy to understand. Fairly good timing and crowd interaction. They got heat on Chetty, who hot tagged to Lynn. As Smothers held Lynn, Tommy Rich went to hit him with a flagpole but Lynn broke away. Smothers took the shot and went down. Lynn then cradled Smothers for the win. The FBI argued amongst themselves after the match until Rich walked out by himself. 1.5 star. 2. Masato Tanaka pinned Doug Furnace in 5:46. Anyway, this should have been a good match on paper. Tanaka was described in the pre-match introduction piece, and give them credit for not just bringing him undead like WWF and WCW would do, as the single most sought-after star in Japan today. Minute. Kanemura, who worked the Michinoku Pro main event on February 28 in Osaka, would have had a difficult time making it, although it was possible, but it didn't happen. There was a communication breakdown in this match as well, and while they pulled off a few athletic spots, it was really a disaster, best epitomized by the finish where both guys just stood there for what seemed like one of those time-stand-still eternities, before Tanaka used a spinning elbow and got the pin. Nobody in the building bought it as the finish, and it was heavily booed because it looked so bad. Individually, these guys are good workers, and even though they have never wrestled each other, you'd think it would be a good mix since Furnace has had many great matches in the past with Mitsuharu Misawa, and Tanaka's style is patterned after Misawa's. It might as well have been Steve McMichael wrestling himself. When Tanaka did it, Death Valley Driver, Styles said that move will forever be known as the Spicoli Driver. Fans chanted Louis when he did the move. Somehow I don't think any other announcer anywhere in the world will pick up on that name. The weak match kind of killed the post-match angle, where a terribly nervous Lance Wright tried to forcefully yell at Furnas, bringing up the names of Jim Ross, Bruce Pritchard and Vincent K. McMahon Jr. and telling him he'd never work on Raw again. Furnas clotheslined Wright, told him to kiss his ass, and put on an ECW t-shirt to get the Pavlovian pop. -1 star. 3. Rob Van Dam, Robert Sotkowski, pinned 2 Cold Scorpio Charles Skaggs in 22:09. This was supposed to be the 4-star classic, but it just exposed how overrated both wrestlers are by insider fans. Van Dam has certain great talents. He has a major league personality, rap and look. He's a fantastic athlete. He does some very unique maneuvers and has a willingness to take great punishment, has a great work rate and takes good bumps. Before he's the next Chris Jericho, let alone the next Shawn Michaels, he needs to learn selling and psychology, but more important, transitions. This match had the feel of 2 guys who were minor leaguers on the indie scene trying to display every moonsault they know, but not being able to do it within the context of doing a match. Basically the difference between an opening match promo Azteca rookie Flyer doing corkscrew planches and shooting star presses and watching Rey Mysterio Jr. and Psicosis do less sophisticated moves, but not setting them up so amateurishly. And where Van Dam really needs work is to learn what he does that looks good and what he does that doesn't, and eliminate the latter, rather than doing everything. If you look at every great worker in this business, whether they be Misawa, Michaels, Hart, Kobashi, Benoit or Guerrero, they do what they can do. We don't know what they do that doesn't look good, because we never see them do it because they've figured out in the midst of a heated struggle if they throw a spin kick that misses by 1.5 feet, and their opponent still sells it, it kills everything they've built up to that point. Why did Ric Flair never throw a dropkick after winning the world title? Because he didn't have a world champion caliber dropkick. Why does Misawa never do a moonsault? Why can Benoit do no wrong, unless he's against Page? Why does Van Dam ever throw a punch? It makes time stand still in his matches with those lame arm punches with no body movement. It's more lame than watching Glacier throw kicks after seeing Dragon on the same TV show. If a match is nothing but a collection of acrobatic moves, and making it look like a match isn't important, then this was the 4-star match it was supposed to be. Van Dam came out wearing a Spicoli t-shirt. After a screwed-up first spot, Scorpio dropkicked Van Dam to the floor. They did a mildly sloppy double monkey flip spot. Outside the ring, Van Dam somersaulted off the ramp and later missed a side kick off the guardrail, and Scorpio gave him a hot shot on the guardrail. Scorpio missed a stinger splash on the guardrail. After Scorpio took a guardrail bump, Van Dam threw him into the ring and leg dropped him from the apron inside. Fans were chanting "This match sucks." At that point they let the crowd get to them and started brawling. Van Dam tried a spin kick off the top that was a little sloppy, then did his trademark rolling somersault splash. At this point the crowd was chanting "boring." Van Dam did a somersault and then crashed into a corner when Scorpio moves. Scorpio hit a power bomb. Thank God the cops didn't come. Scorpio did a somersault leg drop and a flip splash from the apron inside and another leg drop before getting a near fall with a splash off the top. He hit a moonsault for a near fall. There were no transitions between moves at all. Van Dam came off with a frog splash, but Scorpio got his knees up and both guys sold the spot. Van Dam finally made a comeback using his split-legged moonsault. Van Dam began throwing his punches that looked so lame on the pay-per-view national stage. Van Dam used a Hurricane Rana, and then a Van Daminator, which really didn't look good, on the ramp. Scorpio used 2 pile drivers on the ramp. Ref John Finnegan went down, and then Scorpio squashed him again for good measure. Van Dam threw a sloppy kick and then missed a totally awesome Firebird 450 splash. Scorpio came back with a sloppy power bomb and his own Firebird, which was impaled after seeing Van Dam's impressive miss. Sabu came out with a chair off the top. It was called an Arabian facebuster and it at best came close, and put Van Dam on top. When the ref recovered, Scorpio kicked out in a great false finish. Scorpio did a nice kick to Van Dam's face. It wound up with Van Dam reversing a spot into a front cradle for the pin. After the match, Van Dam offered Scorpio his hand, but Van Dam then pulled away. Scorpio offered his, and when Van Dam accepted, suckered him with a clothesline. Sabu came back out, bringing out Sandman. Sandman went to do a Frankensteiner off the top onto Sabu through a table, and actually Sabu did manage to hit and break the table, although Sandman totally blew the spot. 1.5 star. 4. New Jack, Jerome Young, and Spike Dudley. Matt Tyson won a three-way dance over Bubba Ray, Mark LaMonica, and Devon Hughes, Dudley and Axel Rotten, Brian Knighton, and Balls Mahoney, John Reschner, in 1325. Joel Gertner is an absolute classic as Hill ring announcer. After announcing the Dudleys, he said to bring the enhancement talent, the 90s term for jobbers, out in reference to Axel and Balls. They went at it in a brawling tag match for a few minutes until Big Dick interfered and Axel and Balls were laid out. They then made the X sign mocking New Jack, who came out with his garbage can full of weapons, and his music playing about 3 minutes into the match. Hey, after WCW's World War III Battle Royal, everything else is logical. They used all the regular weapons such as a keyboard, chairs, crutches breaking everywhere including on someone's groin. Guys started juicing and they wound up brawling underneath the balcony. Axel, Balls, Spike, and Devon all juiced. The Dudleys were placed on 2 different tables and New Jack and Spike both wound up in the balcony, both doing splashes off the balcony onto a Dudley through a table, about a 14-foot drop. One thing really interesting is that Matt Tyson is actually maybe an inch or 2 taller and 10 pounds heavier than Rey Mysterio Jr. and considerably smaller than Taka or Juventud Guerrera, yet Bubba, who must weigh 350, sells for him and they work credible spots together and nobody in the audience takes Spike as a joke midget doing comedy with big guys because he's not portrayed that way. Hey, I'm just looking to open some closed minds in this business. Spike did a swinging DDT on Balls through a table. The Dudleys did the double team Dudley death drop on Balls for the pin in 12:31. As the Dudleys celebrated, Spike and Jack used simultaneous guitar shots to the head, then Spike came off the ropes with a stone cold stunner, the acid drop on Devon, followed with New Jack coming off the top with a chair onto him for the pin in 13:25. 3¼ stars. Jenna Jameson showed up wanting to interview Justin Credible, who blew her off. She should have blown him off so they could have gotten some mileage out of that word association pun. She then proclaimed her love for the god of all manhood, Tommy Dreamer, who came out and kissed her and she acted like she was, well, you know. 5. Tommy Dreamer, Tom Laughlin, pinned Justin Credible, PJ Walker, in 8:58. They hinted on TV that Beulah was going to leave Dreamer for JC and pushed it hard throughout the pay-per-view show. JC was actually the best worker on the show, taking some real good bumps in the Triple H mold. Dreamer works hard but he's physically shot. He even did a pescado on JC and Jason and monkey flipped JC into a chair. In the ring, Dreamer used a fall-away slam and a low dropkick into a chair into a face. He missed what was called a frog splash off the top. They did a totally messed up try for a Raven drop toe hold into a chair spot. Credible whipped Dreamer into a chair and used a DDT on a chair. Credible came off top with a splash but Dreamer got his feet up and then delivered the Spicoli driver with more chance for Louis. Basically everyone picked up the symbolism here. However, Credible came back and laid Dreamer out with what was called a spinning tombstone, soon to be better known as That's Incredible, except he wasn't spinning so it was just a tombstone. Beulah showed up teased she was with Credible, and then gave him and Jason both low blows and gave Jason a DDT. Nicole Bass, who is actually larger and more muscular than any of the men in the WWF in the 80s except for Hogan and Hellwig, grabbed Beulah in a bear hug and was shaking her. Mikey Whipwreck showed up on crutches limping to the ring and gave Miss Nicole, okay, Mrs. Nicole, she's been married for years, a stunner. Credible then cracked him in the bad knee with a crutch. Dreamer revived at this point and whipped Credible into the ropes where he took a Ray Stevens flip bump into the corner and back into the ring, falling right into Dreamer's DDT for the pin. The clip from Philadelphia last week that already aired on television where Credible used the spinning tombstone on Beulah was hinted about on the air but never shown on the pay-per-view. The decision to nix the clip was because they didn't want to do anything to cause Time Warner to reverse fields due to men beating up women, nor do anything to give Cablevision, the lone holdout, a reason to point to for not airing future shows. Of course Whipwreck did beat up Bass, but due to the visualization difference, it's a man beating up a woman, but in name only. If you notice, WWF also has been gun-shy not showing any clips of Chyna taking the stunner on television after doing the spot on pay-per-view 2 weeks ago. 2 stars. 6. Bam Bam Bigelow. Scott Bigelow won the ECW TV title from Taz, Pete C. Nurka, in 1337. Bigelow did one hell of a job as a veritable bump machine for the first 9 minutes of the match. The highlight was Taz suplexing him off the ramp over the guardrail and into the stands. Back in the ring, Bigelow took the advantage and finally missed a moonsault that he was supposed to hit and they played it as if he hit for a near fall. Taz came back and dropped Bigelow through a table, although the spot was way too long in setting up. At about this point it appeared Bigelow was blown up because the match, which had been very good up to this point, totally ran out of steam. Finally they went to the finish where Taz got the choke. Bigelow fell backwards with him through the ring and to the floor. Bigelow finally came out of the hole in the ring, pulled an unconscious Taz out, and pinned him to win the title. As they were doing the spots outside to distract the audience, they had Mikey Whipwreck and Chris Chetty go under the ring to set up the hole in the ring when they got back in to set up the finish. Creative. 2 1/4 stars. At this point Paul Heyman and Joey Styles got into a totally overacted argument, with Heyman saying that the Al Snow vs. John Kronus match, which had never been mentioned during the entire show and they were already near the main event position, would be cancelled and to show the dreaded Sabu Sandman match. Styles argued, saying that they were warned not to, and if this blew up, it quit the promotion, but of course they showed the match. This whole scenario was done for several purposes, among them giving them a chance to pass out the styrofoam heads to the crowd and create the atmosphere of this wild ring entrance, and secondly, if there were any problems with Sandman Sabu, and there weren't, it could be edited before airing. 7. Sabu, Terry Brunk pinned Sandman, James Fullington, in 9:21 of a Dueling Canes match. At the beginning, Van Dam came out dressed as Sabu and traded a few cane shots with Sandman. After Sabu came out, the Dueling Can stipulation never came into play. It was mainly the Sabu stunt show, but that was about the only way it could be handled since Sandman can't do a thing anymore and Sabu had a good night in that his spots weren't sloppy at all. At one point he springboard off a chair and to the ropes into a plancha on Sandman on the ramp. Sabu did a body block off the ramp and a plancha over the post onto Sandman through a table. Sabu missed an Arabian facebuster and the action went back to the ramp. Sabu hit his triple jump, which is actually a double jump, moonsault on the ramp. For whatever reason, even though he was the one taking the move, Sandman sold it for like 4 seconds, got right up like he wasn't hurt at all and finally threw a table on Sabu. Van Dam came out for the finish doing a side kick off the top rope. Jeff Jones came out for his heel ref bit. Sabu and Van Dam both placed Sandman on a table on the ramp and each came off the top rope crashing through him and Sabu rolled him into the ring for the pin. 2 3/4 stars. 8. Al Snow, Alan Sarvin and Lance Storm, Lance Evers, beat Shane Douglas, Troy Martin, and Chris Candido in 4:49. The ring was still broken and they put up a barricade like there was a pothole in the road, which looked totally amateurish. They announced Sonny was Storm's mystery partner, played up like it was brilliant because not only would Candido never hurt Sonny, but he'd never let Douglas hurt Sonny. The one major negative of using Sonny on the show is that on most ECW shows when Francine is around, everyone's eyes are on her. When Sonny is around, Francine might as well be a guy for all the attention she's going to get. It was really noticeable when they did the TV angle the week earlier, but even more obvious on this show. Storm and Candido did a hot open, then Sonny was tagged in. After it became obvious the guys weren't going to touch her, they had Francine hit the ring and tease a catfight. Sonny wound up with a cookie sheet, but of course turned on Storm with the lamest shot of the entire show, which instead of getting a surprise pop from a turn that probably everyone saw coming, got the groans from an audience that sees too well when things aren't as they are supposed to be. Storm was put in a camel clutch but refused to submit, and when asked to submit, he said that he wanted head. Even though everyone in the crowd, with the heads passed out, had to see this was coming, there was absolutely no reaction when he said it. However, the place did come unglued for Snow's music and went crazy for the ring introduction. Fans were throwing the heads at the ring, the camera angles were upside down and impossible to follow. Heyman termed it an experiment that failed, and maybe 1 minute later Snow delivered the Northern Lights bomb, pulled the snowplow and Douglas for the pin to set up their main event ECW title match on the May 3rd pay-per-view show. The ending scene of the show had the crowd throwing heads in and the triple threat throwing the heads back at the crowd. 1/4 star. The original plan was for Sid Vicious to debut as the mystery partner, but it was one of those communication breakdowns. There were 2 ideas floated, one that Sid would be Sonny's hand-picked partner and Storm would see it as a swerve and KO him. But the chances of Sid going along with that scenario were less than 0%. The more likely scenario was for Bam Bam Bigelow to attack Sid as he was coming to the ring and stretcher him out, starting up a Bigelow versus Vicious feud, paving the way for Snow's run-in and pinning of Douglas, which was the planned finish literally months ago for the show. As it turned out, there was a breakdown in the communication process and at least how things stand at press time. Sid won't be coming in. That's where the finalization of the Sonny idea came, as clearly if they were going to use Sonny in a match, they could have drawn money advertising it. Pro wrestling appears to have become the hottest topic of late on the TSN show Off the Record, stemming from recent appearances by Bret Hart and Vince McMahon. McMahon taped 2 segments on February 20th with host Michael Landsberg, which aired on February 24th and February 25th, largely to answer the charges by Hart regarding the ending of their 14-year business relationship. On the same day and airing that night, was another segment with Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Doak Hendricks. And finally, largely to answer the claim by McMahon that WWF is kicking Ted Turner's ass in every category except television ratings, Eric Bischoff was scheduled for a live interview on the show on March 3rd. For the record, as the transcript we got having not seen the program had a phrase slightly wrong, the admission by McMahon of lying to Hart came when Landsberg said after McMahon kept beating around the bush on the question, so that when he says that you lied to him as he was heading into the ring, it was McMahon who interrupted the rest of the question by saying, "He's right. I couldn't take a risk after asking, after he breached his contract several times before, denying what it was that we wanted. I couldn't take a risk that he was going to just walk out and leave fans all over the world with nothing." During the show, McMahon claimed that he didn't believe in creative control clauses, although admitting Hart had one in his contract, and mentioned how they lead to problems, citing WCW. Clauses or no clauses in contracts, when it comes to problems with getting top talent to do jobs, neither company has any kind of exclusive on that problem, and when it comes to dropping titles, McMahon has had far more problems than Bischoff in recent months, particularly in the wake of Montreal. He also said that he didn't believe creative control had to do with finishes of matches, which is why he claimed Hart breached his contract first by not going along with McMahon's proposed finish. One can debate eternally whether dropping the title 4 days later or 1 month later would be reasonable or unreasonable, and those who defend McMahon in this situation have to have some point, since defending his position requires overlooking blatant and admitted lying. Of course, a 100% defense of Hart requires overlooking an assault, even if the assault was a manipulated situation. It's a little harder to argue that a reasonable creative control clause doesn't have at least something to do with match finishes. As the November 17th issue showed in the timeline, McMahon suggested so many different finishes and plot lines, changing with every conversation. There were several suggested finishes for Survivor Series that included Hart losing the title, although in all of them, he was promised it back on the following pay-per-view should he stay, another promise that probably was not going to be delivered. McMahon also suggested several finishes that Hart retain the title, including the finish he suggested and laid out to Hart that didn't happen that both agreed to. To after the fact state that Bret knew he wanted him to lose isn't either true nor false, but it is misleading. At times Hart knew that. At times Hart was told exactly the opposite. Before Hart made the decision to leave, the promise was always that if he lost to Michaels, he'd get the belt back later, either in December or January depending upon which conversation. After Hart made the decision to leave, there were at least 4 different finishes suggested in that final 9 days, him losing cleanly, him losing due to outside interference, his winning cleanly in the middle which supposed Michaels then nixed, and his winning via DQ which was the final agreement. The last day he was told by McMahon an involved description of how the match should go, with no suggestion being made whatsoever of Hart losing, no argument being put up that he wanted anything different, and no attempt to plead the merits to attempt to get Hart to change his mind, let alone order something and have Hart turn it down, as McMahon has portrayed everywhere since then. On the first show, McMahon stated that his belief there should be no limits in what could be portrayed on his television show other than no guns, no knives, no rapes, and no robberies. I'm not sure number 1 and number 3 to an extent haven't already been violated. Well, number 1 was for sure, and number 3 was certainly portrayed in regard to certainly the strong hints of having sex against the wishes of the woman, both involving Brian Pillman, so it was kind of a silly answer. He believed there was no subject material that should be off limits, and when the host talked about his own children watching and getting mixed messages as to what is real and what isn't on wrestling, that it's the job for parents to talk to their kids about that. He also stated that 2 guys in their underwear wrestling around, it's awfully boring. Landsberg, after grilling McMahon most of the first show, was a lot easier on him the second show, comparing him favorably with David Stern of the NBA as the best marketer in all of sports and praising him many times for his ability to paint a visual picture. When Nitro's TV ratings were brought up, McMahon claimed that Nitro was the most heavily promoted television show in history, crediting that for the ratings, which is totally a ridiculous statement. He claimed that Ted Turner has never had an original idea in his life, but he's very good at copying things. In regard to Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall leaving, Landsberg asked if McMahon had any regrets. McMahon responded saying, "I would suggest with Hogan, no, I don't regret that. With Scott Hall and Diesel perhaps. That is when we started doing guaranteed contracts, because we stayed out of that as long as we could. But right after that is when we started, and that is what made them go to Turner, and that, and of course the sum of money. I don't know that it was a mistake." When asked about taking Hogan back, he said, "Only on the right terms. I certainly wouldn't take him back in terms of a bidding war between Turner and the WWF. In response to the charge that what is happening to McMahon now is just positions changing from 10 years ago when McMahon ran the regionals out of business, McMahon claimed that they all put themselves out of business, and that he was just a young kid competing with all the elderly millionaires who had far more financial resources than he did. That reminds me of a story from when that was going on, and I went to a wrestling show in Kansas City at the Memorial Hall when Bob Geigel ran that territory. As I came in the building, there was Geigel, hardly nattily attired like McMahon always was and is, holding a toilet plunger as there had been a problem in the bathroom and he was taking care of it. We all joked about how ridiculous the competition was financially at that time, since Geigel at the time was the NWA president, because I don't think anyone could ever McMahon dressed like that fixing stuffed-up toilets. I think that paints the picture of the actual financial resources most of McMahon's competitors had in those days. Lonsberg brought up taking Rupert Murdoch as a partner, and McMahon shunned that line of thinking but did say that one day they might want to make the WWF a public company, although gave the impression that day was a long way away. It's probably a lot longer away now than it looked to be 6 months ago, because the WWF has totally turned things around when it comes to overall profitability for reasons explained many times here in the past. McMahon said that he enjoyed the competition as it is now because other than TV ratings, we are kicking Ted Turner's ass. He called the Goldust parody of Dusty Rhodes. When Lonsberg brought it up as a slap in the face of a performer with his competitors, he said that the WWF would never do something like that, and that it was a tribute to Rhodes, and claimed Rhodes laughed so hard hearing about it. In regard to the Melanie Pillman interview on Raw the night after Bryan died, he was asked if he regretted it, and he said no, meaning he must have been just about the only person in the universe who didn't, at least after the fact. I don't regret that whatsoever. The purpose for having Melanie on was because at the time Brian Pillman was a real free spirit. Brian Pillman was known from time to time to use recreational drugs, and it was thought at the time by his wife that was one of the reasons why he died. So I gave her the forum to say, maybe everyone can learn from this, maybe everyone can benefit from this tragedy. And that is why we had Melanie on, to be able to say that about Brian. As it turned out, he had a heart attack and a defective heart. And finally, McMahon was asked to give quick reactions to certain names. Ultimate Warrior, lunatic. Eric Bischoff, don't know him that well. From his reputation, not a nice man. Hulk Hogan, not as big as he thinks he is. Bruno Sammartino, a confused individual suffering from dementia, but one with a great reputation. Rick Rude, someone who would like to be in this era performing with the greats, but can't. Jesse Ventura, overrated at the time, and still is confused about his place in the history of the WWF. Kevin Nash, a very fortunate individual that someone finally saw the talent and gave him the opportunity to be somebody. Vince McMahon, the luckiest man on earth. I've got it all. A wonderful family, the privilege of being in a company and doing what I love, which is entertaining people. It's the biggest thrill of my life, apart from my family. The comments on Sammartino were interesting only because recently some in the WWF have attempted to pacify Sammartino and bury the hatchet with him, and it had worked to the point that Sammartino leaned toward McMahon's side in the Bret Hart controversy in an interview in the Wrestling Perspective newsletter. I believe McMahon and Sammartino actually haven't spoken since appearing on the Phil Donahue show together in 1992, and as a side note on that situation, the reason I was sitting next to McMahon on that show is because the original plan was for Sammartino to sit next to McMahon because the belief was they would be the focal point of the show. Sammartino made a comment in front of the producer and also myself about being afraid he couldn't control himself if McMahon were to tell a lie and being afraid he'd hit him. Coming off a situation on Larry King a few days earlier with Sammartino and McMahon in separate studios, and McMahon attempting to make a fool out of Sammartino by acting like he didn't know what he was talking about, even though it was Sammartino who was the one telling the truth and McMahon who was lying, or at least being highly misleading. At every opportunity, there was intense heat between the two already. Figuring it very likely that based on his performance a few days earlier that McMahon wasn't going to be honest on that show either, I volunteered to take the seat and they sat Sammartino as far away from McMahon as possible. Reports elsewhere that Sammartino was going to appear at WrestleMania based on what we've heard were not true, that there were no plans to ask him and that he had definitely not been asked, let alone agreed, but there were people attempting to go through some of Sammartino's friends including Dominic DeNucci to get the two sides to bury the hatchet. That's why McMahon's comments were surprising, particularly to those who were in the process of trying to smooth things out. In regard to the Montreal finish, Helmsley, who said he had nothing at all against Hart, claimed Michaels didn't know the finish and compared Hart's behavior to that of Hulk Hogan in 1993 when he refused to drop the title to Hart, still maintaining the size concept from the 80s, and instead dropped it to Yokozuna and 7 weeks later quit the promotion. As with every analogy, there are both similarities and differences in the respective situations. Among them, personal heat and history existed in one and not the other, and the main points being that Hart was specific about finally willing to lose to Michaels, although not in Canada, and that Hart had brought up simply vacating the title a la Michaels, and it isn't known if Hogan simply picked a different foe to lose to or also wanted to leave without dropping the title in the ring. After a week filled with rumors, some substantiated and others unfounded, swirling around the United States and Mexico, truth and fiction seemed to have been cleared up, but in the wake of it, Mexico's Promo Azteca promotion and the plight of the Mexican wrestlers in WCW appears to be in trouble. It started when WCW and Promo Azteca tried to start negotiations through a contact WCW International rep Sharon Saidello had with a former vice president of TV Azteca for WCW to attempt to syndicate the Azteca television show in the United States on Telemundo, the #2 Spanish-language television network in the United States, as a forerunner to doing quarterly Lucha Libre pay-per-view shows. Meetings between all sides are scheduled in about 2 weeks in Miami. In the course of the conversations, in which Konnan wasn't part of, Konnan was blamed as the intermediary for the lack of communication between both offices and claims he made about power within the other organizations. Both sides then told the other that Konnan had no power within either organization other than being a wrestler with the respective companies. These negotiations were starting at about the same time Antonio Pena announced that 4 major superstars would be debuting for AAA at its March 1st show at El Toreo in Naucalpan, and that Konnan no-showed a television taping on February 20th in Tulancingo. At that point, the natural rumors began that Konnan and 3 other top wrestlers affiliated with him would be the ones, at which point Promo Azteca co-owner Jorge Rojas sent a letter to WCW telling them Konnan had no decision-making authority as far as either ownership nor booking power in the Azteca company. Konnan missed the date, claiming he had been in an auto accident on the way to the show, and before realizing that any problems were even brewing, left Mexico for San Francisco for the WCW pay-per-view and Nitro in the Bay Area, and upon returning, did appear for his Azteca bookings this week. It ended with more interesting correspondence and rumors flying back and forth, finally at the end of this week to WCW Vice President Nick Lambros sending Konnan a letter stating in no uncertain terms that he, along with every Mexican wrestler in WCW, was under exclusive contract to WCW internationally. That means they were specifically told they are no longer allowed to wrestle in Mexico, which means basically every top name except for a handful of the Promo Azteca headline talent, almost crippling the promotion that has made great strides in popularity in recent months. In addition, WCW told Konnan he had to cease booking Azteca lineups and angles and booking Azteca talent to other organizations around the world. The ban on the WCW Mexican talent working in that country is going to be most difficult to enforce since aside from major shows and television tapings, it is virtually impossible to get any spot show news out of Mexico. It is possible the explicit ban may have also been a strike by WCW to keep its talent from working for Pena since those rumors were flying all week, although there has been no substantiation, as at this point, that there was anything to it other than rumors of a different wrestler within the Azteca organization allegedly contacting Pena, although it's disputed as to what the contact was even about, and nothing further materializing. Any Konnan/Pena relationship at this point doesn't appear to have been possible in the first place for a number of reasons. The main one, besides bitter feelings and lawsuits back and forth from both sides that are still outstanding, would have been, is that Pena's television show airs in the United States on Galavision, which would mean that talent would appear on American TV without WCW authorization, which just isn't going to happen. At press time, several of the Mexican wrestlers had either just learned or had yet to learn of their being banned in Mexico. Of those who had learned, the reaction was extremely negative. While they all earn more money in WCW than Mexico, although some, La Parka and maybe Silver King in particular, may have been able to earn as much if not more than they do in WCW as full-time headliners in Mexico, they are treated generally as jobbers rather than as superstars as they are when they work at home. With the exception of Konnan and Mysterio Jr., none, when signing 2-year contracts with WCW a few months back, actually thought the contracts would prohibit them from remaining wrestling stars in their native land, as even if they knew the contract did prohibit it, the belief was those clauses wouldn't be enforced, just like WCW lets so many of its contracted wrestlers work independent shows on their off dates in the United States while looking the other way. In addition, this move basically cuts the throat of Azteca, which was trying to enter into a television business deal with them, as most of their biggest draws are the guys under WCW contract. The belief from the Mexican wrestlers is that it was considered a wink-wink deal when they signed their exclusive rights contracts, and that with the exception of Konnan and Mysterio Jr., due to them having the largest contracts and because WCW was always in fear of Mysterio Jr. getting injured, that they really didn't care what the rest of the Mexican crew did in their country so long as they didn't appear in the United States. WCW was apparently concerned because of the belief that the Mexican wrestlers were all flagrantly violating their contracts by working in Mexico, and perhaps will still allow it, but wanted to exercise booking power over it. There were always concerns when a Mexican wrestler missed a WCW date, which wasn't an infrequent occurrence, that they were working a show in Mexico while claiming to be ill or injured, since they get the guaranteed weekly check from WCW and could augment the income with a payoff from Mexico. There is no documented cases of this happening that we are aware of, and we'd probably on this subject have a lot better idea of what's going on than WCW. One wrestler in particular who may be affected the most seriously is Norman Smiley, who wrestles in Mexico as Black Magic. Smiley, who is now living in Mexico but is not a Mexican citizen, may end up deported since he is living there on a working visa, and if he's not allowed to work there, would conceivably be not allowed to stay there. Conan was considered the major power force behind booking the Azteca promotion, including dealings with sending Azteca talent to international tours or contracts to places like Japan, Puerto Rico, WWF, and conceivably even ECW. He worked and is believed to have booked the Azteca television tapings on February 26 in Toluca and February 27 in Pachuca, and gave a lengthy speech to the fans after his match on the latter show proclaiming his loyalty to the fans of Mexico. On the television show that aired this weekend, which was taped on the card that he no-showed, it was simply announced Conan wasn't there for his advertised main event match with no explanation given. Not only was Conan banned from having any hand in those bookings, but was told his contract prohibits him from so much as contributing any booking ideas to the Azteca promotion, such as angles leading to big matches or gimmicks for new wrestlers. It is believed that Conan was 20% owner of the Azteca promotion along with Rojas and Pedro Ortega. Promo Azteca, WCW and Telemundo have meetings next week with the proposed idea for WCW to syndicate a 2-hour weekly Azteca television show, and once it's established, leading to doing quarterly pay-per-view shows in the United States and perhaps Mexico as well. The lone attempt at doing Mexican pay-per-view, the well-received November 6, 1994 /A/IWC When Worlds Collide show drew an 0.28 buy rate and 44,000 total buys, basically along the lines or slightly better than the ECW level. However, all the parties involved couldn't ever get their acts together to follow up on the first show. There was a lot of internal jealousy at the time, since the AAA promotion was actually doing bigger house show business in its markets than WCW was, jealousy that wouldn't exist today due to WCW's success. The problem with finalizing the deal is that Telemundo wanted production upgrades on the Azteca show, largely along the lines of better lighting, along with expansion of the 90-minute Mexican show to fill a 2-hour American time slot that would cost the Azteca promotion an estimated $8,000 per week. At that point in time, WCW would loan Promo Azteca 8 of its contracted Mexican wrestlers to work as television headliners to work the pay-per-view. Even by the recent hot standards of the industry, the demand for Nitro tickets has been closer to major concert standards than pro wrestling standards even during its previous hottest periods. On February 27, tickets were put on sale for the Nitro on April 13 at the Target Center in Minneapolis, with the governor proclaiming it as Ric Flair Day in the state of Minnesota and Flair being honored and spearheading the ticket sales. The building was sold out in 5 hours, totaling 14,667 tickets and $270,376, making it the most impressive first day all things considered up to that point in company history. The all-time City Gate record is the AWA Wrestle Rock show on April 20, 1986, with the triple headliner of Greg Gagne and Jimmy Snuka versus Bruiser Brody and Nor the Barbarian in a cage match, Road Warriors versus Freebirds in a cage match, and Stan Hansen versus Nick Bockwinkel for the AWA title, which drew about 16,000 fans to the Metrodome for an estimated $300,000. During the Hulk Hogan era in the early 80s, the AWA had drawn larger crowds, but not larger gates, in the market, frequently selling out the nearby St. Paul Civic Center. As impressive as that was, the next day tickets were put on sale for the March 23 Nitro in Louisville at Freedom Hall, and the results were probably even more impressive. The show sold out in 4.5 hours in a city that doesn't have the kind of history of six-figure gates for pro wrestling that Minneapolis has. With Jimmy Hart, who was one of the all-time greatest territorial managers during his heyday with the local promotion in the early 80s, handling the first day promotion, the building sold out with 13,856 tickets and $238,820. Absolutely devastating every pro wrestling record ever in that city. With virtually no publicity outside its hardcore fan base, The UFC will present its first pay-per-view show of 1998 on March 13th from New Orleans, Louisiana. From a hardcore standpoint, this looks on paper to be the best UFC show to date, and with a series of the hardest to predict matches to boot. But UFC can't survive just on its hardcore fan base. In a gamble, the company is going to attempt to market Frank Shamrock 2-1 as its top star for the show. Although Shamrock is not a heavyweight, at about 193 pounds, he is still larger than the company's first major drawing card, Royce Gracie. And Shamrock was given no pushover as his first challenger for the UFC middleweight championship in Igor Zinoviev, 4-0-1, a similarly sized Russian who was champion in this same weight class in the now-defunct Extreme Fighting Championships. The two ironically have two common opponents, Enson Inoue and John LeBay. Shamrock knocked out Inoue in 17 minutes on November 29 in a match that probably had the most exciting finish of any NHB match of the past few years. Zinoviev made much shorter work of Inoue, in less than 1 minute when they met in 1996. Shamrock's first NHB match after leaving Pancrase was in January 1997 in Honolulu against LeBay, and Shamrock dominated the first half of the match but was unable to finish LeBay, who made a strong comeback at the end, and LeBay won a split decision after 30 minutes in another unknown NHB Classic event. Zinoviev also fought to a draw with LeBay on an EFC show over 15 minutes, although in that match, Zinoviev would have certainly won the decision. There is internal fear that Zinoviev may wind up being like a fantasy pro wrestling character and not tap if put in a bad position, the fear that Shamrock may injure him due to his guts if that were to happen. Zinoviev, 30, is 5 years older and has been plagued with injuries over the past year. Shamrock has a 5-match winning streak which includes a decision win over 30-pound heavier Tsuyoshi Kosaka in rings, submission wins in under 1 minute against two Olympic wrestlers in Dan Henderson and Kevin Jackson, and the knockout of Shudo's world heavyweight champion Inoue. Zinoviev been nicknamed Houdini for his ability to get out of seemingly disastrous situations. The only current pro wrestler on the show, Kosaka, will have his first NHB match against Kimo Leopoldo, 7-2-1, conqueror of several pro wrestlers in Japan previously. Kosaka is considered the more skilled of the two, but has never fought, is expected to give up at least 40 pounds and a lot of strength as Kimo is coming in big, and Dan Severn, who has faced the best wrestlers in the world over a world-class career, claimed Kimo is perhaps the strongest man he'd ever locked up with. Kimo's only career blemishes are losses to NHB legends Ken Shamrock and Royce Gracie, and a draw with Severn last year at the Tokyo Dome in a poor match. Jackson, 3-1, the 1992 Olympic gold medalist and 1997 World Cup champion who is still one of the best wrestlers in the world, has an interesting match against Lions Den fighter Jerry Bolander, 7-2. Both have UFC tournament wins under their belt, one with no competition, and are coming off decisive losses. The winner would become the logical top contender for the Shamrock-Zinoviev winner. Jackson will be looking for redemption after his 14 seconds loss to Shamrock, against a fighter that Shamrock trained up until a few months back. Bolander, coming off a loss to undefeated Murilo Bustamante via knockout in Brazil on September 26, is a strong wrestler, but Jackson is a totally different level there, so his key is trapping Jackson with a submission. This leaves the UFC's fight under 170-pound tournament. Mikey Burnett, a Lions Den fighter who is an accomplished wrestler, a ferocious puncher and has world-class powerlifting strength, debuts on the major league stage against far more experienced Brazilian Eugenio Tato, ranked number 3 in the world in that weight class, known for a legendary draw with Royler Gracie years back and a recent no contest with Renzo Gracie in a match that ended in a riot. The other first-round match has Pat Militic, 18-1-1, whose lone loss was when the doctor stopped his EFC match against Matt Hume due to a broken nose, facing Townsend Saunders, who captured a silver medal at 152 pounds in the 1996 Olympics in his NHB debut. There are 2 alternate matches in case of injuries in the first round of the tournament, with Chris Brennan vs. Courtney Turn and Laverne Clark vs. Josh Stewart. Japanese television rundown. February 15, All Japan Women. This was a television taping which took place after midnight at the Fuji TV Network studios in downtown Tokyo. The building, which was about half the size of the ECW arena, was packed with 3,000 people turned away. Because the studio taping concept, once the standard for pro wrestling, is again something new. The atmosphere, something AJW television for the most part has been lacking over the past year, was really good, and this had to be considered overall a successful show. They apparently had several celebrities that had no clue about wrestling as part of the announcing team. 1. Manami Toyota pinned Tomoko Watanabe in 10:51 with a Japanese Ocean Cyclone suplex off the ropes. Crowd was really hot for this match. Toyota basically did the same stuff she's been doing now for 10 years, but there's nothing new to her these days. Her stuff was so inventive when she was coming up, and it's now like watching her is passé. When Toyota did a spin bump off a clothesline, one of the celebrity announcers literally freaked out. When Toyota did her running springboard flip plancha out, she didn't get the height she used to, so she can't just jump to the top rope anymore, so kind of springboarded off her knees instead. 3 stars. 2. Chiru, a 17-year-old from Social Pro Wrestling Federation who does a high school baton twirler gimmick, and considering her age, basically that's what she probably would be if she wasn't in pro wrestling. Beat Noriko Toyota, a 15-year-old rookie for AJW. Chiru used an offshoot of a German suplex in 311, which they called a Chiru special. Fundamentally sound, but neither did anything special to make you stand up and take notice. 3. Next was what was billed as a Force 4 scramble match. It was 2 teams, with Kaoru Ito captaining a team with Emi Motokawa, Miyuki Fuji, and Sachi Nishibori against Yumiko Hata's team with Keo Nomi, Mio Wakasawa, and Kumiko Makawa. The rules were that each team would pick a batting order, and it would be elimination style, with 5-minute time limits on the matches. If the match went the time limit, both wrestlers would be eliminated. It would continue until one team was down to their last wrestler, and then the time limit would be waived and they'd do no time limit matches until one team had no members left. Ito led off for her team against Nomi, and basically destroyed her in 43 seconds with a somersault sent off the middle ropes. Hata came in next, and the 2 captains went the 5 minutes, both being eliminated. Ito at one point did a double foot stomp off the top rope to the floor. As a match it was good, but too short for workers of this caliber. Wakasawa then pinned Nishibori in 2:37 with a fisherman suplex. Nishibori is really small, but she's a good athlete. Wakasawa, who is 18, does some things well, but her stomping is really bad and she relies on it too much. Wakasawa then pinned Fuji in 1:31 with a splash off the top rope. This put Wakasawa against Motokawa with no time limit, but Motokawa pinned her with La Magistral in 48 seconds. This put Motokawa versus Maekawa in the finals, with Maekawa scoring the pin in 2:39 with an X kick, giving Hata's team the win. An overall good match, 2.5 stars. 3. Eagle Sawai and Sayuri Okino of LLPW beat Takako Inoue and Momoi Nakanishi in 11:59. This was the best match on the show. Sawai and Okino were accompanied by Michiko Nagashima, who interfered throughout the match. The story of the match was Nakanishi, the 17-year-old who is the best young wrestler in AJW in years. In fact, I'd go so far as to say, with the possible exception of Juventud Guerrera and Manami Toyota, I've never seen a wrestler at that age be so good. Nakanishi wound up being pinned by Okino using a fisherman suplex. 3.5 stars. After the match, a bunch of challenges were thrown. Sawai challenged Shinobu Kandori, the LLPW champion, who was doing announcing at ringside, to a match. At this point, Hata, the WWWA, AJW's top belt champ, came out and challenged Kandori for a unification match, which will take place on March 21st at Korakuen Hall on an LLPW show. Interesting to see them run an angle on AJW for an LLPW house show, even though an AJW wrestler is in the main event. Kandori and Hata wound up with a pull-apart. And even stranger is them heavily promoting and showing clips of Kyoko Inoue training the other Neo Ladies wrestlers at her dojo. 4. Kyoko Inoue drew Toshio Yamada of Gia over 10 minutes. Match was solid from start to finish, but there was nothing special and it was nowhere close the level of the matches these two had in their 1991 to 1995 peak years. 2.25 stars. Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio, and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. March 9, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Puerto Rico. La Tigresa, real name Soldalina Vargas, who has been the perennial WWC Women's Champion on and off for years, was arrested on February 25 as part of a gang that allegedly trafficked heroin and cocaine in the state penitentiary. Vargas was one of 4 people arrested, including her boyfriend and her mother, after 4 undercover police officers purchased approximately $400,000 worth of heroin as well as cocaine from the gang. Vargas was held on $75,000 bail and had her car confiscated due to the high purity of the heroin she sold. In addition, her boyfriend Carlos Gonzalez was charged with 15 counts of heroin sales and held on $220,000 bail. Her mother, Sofia Villanueva, was charged with 12 counts of heroin sales and held on $90,000 bail. The Headhunters have returned, and are doing a lot of singles matches going under the names Dingo and Quango. The headline feuds are Ray Gonzalez vs Fidel Sierra over the Universal title, Carlos Colon vs Solitario, El Bronco, in barbed wire, cage and chain matches and street fights with Victor the Bodyguard vs Rico Suave. El Nene, Milton Adorno, returned to WWC after losing a match on March-September 97 to Carlos Colon with the stipulation he would have to leave for 1 year. He returned after 48 weeks, which even though 1 month early, must be a pro wrestling record when it comes to adhering to stipulations of that type. Actually, Nene lost because he was going to Savio Vega's rival promotion, but that group folded. Adorno is actually a police officer, which shows the mix of talent in WWC since they've had 2 police officers working, Law Lay being the other, and an alleged heroin dealer. At Kimalumba, Ben Peacock aka Giant Kimala 2 in All Japan, has already left after not being paid for 2 weeks. Aldo Ortiz, Ricky Santana, and David Cannell, Fidel Sierra, are the new bookers. On the February 22nd TV show they announced there will be a tournament for the WWC Tag Team titles because the Texas Hangmen, who are jobbers disorderly conduct in WCW now, haven't defended the belts in 30 days. Actually, Mike Moran left Puerto Rico with both belts because the promotion owed him $1,400. Although they had no physical belts, they switched the tag titles numerous times after the Hangmen left, with the last champions being Mark and Chris Youngblood, and the belts haven't been mentioned since August. Glamour boy Shane also has gone over money. Mexico. Shocker and Mr. Niebla won the tournament to become the new CMLL Tag Team Champions, beating Dr. Wagner Jr. and Emilio Charles Jr. on February 6th at Arena Coliseo. Wagner and Charles then split up their team and began their headline feud. With Wagner leaving for Japan this week, the feud probably had a blow-off this past Friday, and it wouldn't be surprising to have seen Charles come out of it with Wagner's CMLL light heavyweight title. Apparently the hottest thing in Mexico right now are the Brennan brothers, who are 2 early 20s television stars who starred on probably the hottest primetime show on Mexican television, a cross between Cops and America's Funniest Home Videos. They've done angles for AAA, which led to drawing 11,000 fans in Madero several weeks back, and were working a cage match against Pentagon and Abismo Negro for AAA's return to El Toreo in Naucalpan on March 1st. We don't have any word about the show, but the expectation was that it would sell out the 18,000-seat building, making it the largest crowd for pro wrestling in Mexico since a similar-sized crowd for an AAA Spectacular in Guadalajara some months back. The main event on the show was a hair versus hair match with Heavy Metal versus Sangre Chicana, plus they had the second annual Rey de Reyes, King of Kings, tournament with Pero Aguayo, La Parca Jr., Cobarde, Electroshock, Latin Lover, Blue Demon Jr., The Killer, Black Demon, AAA Mascara Sagrada, Cibernetico, Pero Aguayo Jr., Chiba, Mascara Sagrada Jr., Octagon, Fuerza Guerrera, and Sexy Pisces. The February 27th show at Arena Mexico was headlined by Wagner defending the CMLL light heavyweight title against Charles, Negro Casas and Ultimo Dragon, and Felino versus El Hijo del Santo and Karloff Lagarde Jr. and Bestia Salvaje and Atlantis and La Fiera and Pantera versus Cien Caras and Mascara Año 2000 and Universo 2000. The major Azteca shows for the week were February 26th in Pachuca and February 27th in Toluca. The first night had Conan and Original Mascara Sagrada and Super Parka and Lismark Jr. versus Pierroth Jr. and Black Magic and Silver King and Dandy, Tarzan Boy and Zorro and Torero and Super Astro versus Jerry Estrada and Juventud Guerrera and Villano 3 and El Texano, Venom Black and Mr. Aguila and Shiryu and Super Colo versus Super Crazy and Mosco de la Merced and Halloween and Pantera del Ring and Super Muñeco and Oro Jr. Electra and Mega Electra versus Damien and Jurassico and Motocross and El Hijo del Diablo. February 27th has Conan and Vampiro and La Parca and Zorro versus Pierroth and Magic and Silver King and Texano, Lismark Jr. and Tarzan Boy and Aguila and Salcero versus Estrada and Juventud Guerrera and Villano 3 and Dandy and Astro and Super Parka and Colo and Mega Electra versus Pantera del Ring and Ultimo Rebelde and Brazo de Platino and Brazo Cibernetico. Both shows sold out, with the main angles leading to the Venom Black versus Super Crazy Mask versus Hair and Aguila versus Mosco Mask versus Mask matches on March 6th in Naucalpan. Other feuds they started over the weekend were Dandy versus Salcero, Estrada versus Parka and Sagrada versus Pierroth. Former WCW Barry Houston has been contacted about coming in doing a combination Stevie Richards and male stripper gimmick and forming a tag team with Black Magic, with Magic acting like his pimp. Of course that one could be out the window by now. Also expected in was Dick Togo from Michinoku Pro as a heel. Azteca is expected to start a tournament to crown its first world heavyweight champion. Juventud Guerrera worked both the February 26th and February 27th shows still wearing his mask. When he returned to Mexico, he claimed that he went into hostile territory, U.S., and the promotion stole his mask. Since the mask is licensed in Mexico and was lost outside of licensed territory, the commission accepted his story and allowed him to wear it. The idea was to build to a mask versus hair match with Tarzan Boy in a few weeks, but again, who knows with the current political situation if that's possible anymore. Hisatsun Shinma, a Japanese promoter, is looking to book 8 Azteca wrestlers, looks to be Mosco, Venom Black, Aguila, Oro Jr. and New Brazos, for a tour, while noted Japanese magazine writer Thomas Dr. Lucha Shimizu is running his own Lucha Libre tour of Japan looking for 16 wrestlers. All Japan. The first Budokan Hall show of the year took place on February 28 before a legitimate sellout of 16,300 fans. In the main event, Mitsuharu Misawa retained the Triple Crown, pinning Johnny Ace in 33-34 using a Tiger Driver 91 in what was said to have been not at the level of most Triple Crown matches. Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Taue retained the double tag team titles, beating Steve Williams and Gary Albright in 11-10 when Kawada pinned Albright after an enzujiri, returning the favor since Kawada lost to Albright in a singles match earlier in the tour. The other top match had Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama winning over the former Kingdom duo of Yoshihiro Takayama and Masahito Kakihara in 13:56 when Kobashi pinned Kakihara after a lariat. It was said to have been overall a good show. New Japan. Besides the announcements regarding the Tokyo Dome show and the Inoki tournament, they also announced lineups for the major shows on the next tour from March 6th to March 22nd. It's basically the regular stuff, with the only foreigners on the tour being Big Titan, NWO Sting, Michael Wallstreet and Dr. Wagner Jr. Big show lineups are March 6th in Niigata, Wagner and Jushin Liger vs. Koji Kanemoto and Shinjiro Otani, El Samurai vs. Kendo Kashin, Tadao Yasuda vs. Titan, Junji Hirata and Kazuo Yamazaki and Kensuke Sasaki vs. NWO Sting and Hiroyoshi Tenzan, and Keiji Muto, Osamu Nishimura and Manabu Nakanishi and Satoshi Kojima vs. Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto and Shiro Koshinaka and Tatsumi Fujinami and Shinya Hashimoto vs. Wallstreet and Masahiro Chono. March 9th in Kyoto, Liger and Samurai vs. Otani and Tatsuhiro Takaiwa, Kanemoto vs. Kashin, Hashimoto vs. NWO Sting, Yasuda and Nakanishi and Kojima vs. Titan and Wallstreet and Tenzan, Hirata and Yamazaki and Sasaki vs. Ohara and Goto and Koshinaka, Fujinami and Nishimura vs. Chono and Muto. March 14th in Sendai, Liger vs. Kashin, Nishimura and Hirata vs. Goto and Koshinaka, Kojima vs. Ohara, Nakanishi and Sasaki vs. Titan and NWO Sting, Yasuda and Hashimoto vs. Wallstreet and Chono and Fujinami and Yamazaki vs. Tenzan and Muto. And finally March 22nd in Nagoya, Liger and Wagner vs. Takaiwa and Kanemoto, Otani vs. Kashin, Nishimura and Nakanishi vs. Ohara and Goto, Kengo Kimura and Koshinaka vs. NWO Sting and Tenzan, Kojima and Hashimoto vs. Wallstreet and Muto, Kazuyuki Fujita vs. Igor Mindert, Yamazaki vs. Don Fry, Yoshiaki Fujiwara vs. Brian Johnston, Naoya Ogawa vs. David Beneteau and Fujinami and Sasaki vs. Titan and Chono. As you can see, the focal point here is to have Fujinami in the main event every night to re-establish him leading up to the title match against Sasaki, and have Kashin work singles against the rest of the top junior heavyweights to get him ready for the singles shot at Liger's belt. There are rumors everywhere regarding the New Japan/WCW relationship. Last week's report that New Japan canceled WCW bookings for March was a typo, as it was meant to read May. Willem Ruska, one of Inoki's legendary opponents in the late 70s, was in Japan this week talking to New Japan. He'll probably wind up being one of the special guests for the Inoki retirement show. Other Japan notes. It appears once again that the Kingdom promotion is just about finishes. This past week, Yoji Anjo, Kenichi Yamamoto and Hiromitsu Kanehara announced they were leaving the promotion, leaving them with almost no wrestlers. No card has been announced for their next scheduled show on March 20th in Yokohama. It isn't known where Anjo and Kanehara will wind up, but Yamamoto signed a contract with Rings and debuts on March 28th at Tokyo Bay NK Hall. The first K1 show of the year is April 9th in Yokohama Arena, headlined by Ernesto Hoost vs. Peter Aerts. Maurice Smith appears on the undercard. Michinoku Pro has a major show on March 10th at Tokyo Ota Ward Gymnasium with Super Delphin and Yoshihiro Tajiri of Big Japan vs. Jinsei Shinzaki and Shoichi Funaki. All Japan Women and LLPW have a world title unification match on March 21st at Korakuen Hall with Yumiko Hata vs. Shinobu Kandori. Rings on March 28th has Kiyoshi Tamura vs. Dick Frey, Tsuyoshi Kosaka vs. Nikolai Zuev, Bram Zaza vs. They're going to try and bring in a UFC fighter for this match. Masayuki Naruse vs. Gilbert Yvel, Wataru Sakata vs. Willie Peters, rematch of a controversial match in Amsterdam, and Kenichi Yamamoto debuts against Valentin Novarim. Mitsuya Nagai, 29, has quit this company after being with Maida since his pro debut 1991. Pancrase on March 1st in Kobe before a sellout 3,350 head. Keiichiro Yamamiya beat Minoru Suzuki via decision after they went 20 minutes. This was weird since Pancrase fighters never complain about finishes by tradition, but after the match Suzuki said that he was kicked low during the match. Yamamiya went after his eyes and should have been penalized points for this, so it was a bad decision. Kiyuma Kunyoku beat Asami Shibuya via decision after 20 minutes, and third from the top had Jason DeLucia beating Satoshi Hasegawa when the doctor stopped the match due to blood. AJW on March 1st at Korakuen Hall headlined with Hata and Takako Inoue against masked A and B. To make sure everyone who didn't know and everyone does know who they are, Kaoru Ito did her trademark double foot stomp spots and Tomoko Watanabe did her screwdriver. Inoue unmasked Ito, but she had a second mask underneath. Apparently rookie Nana Nakahara and another woman named Tamakame Isozaki, who has yet to make her pro debut, will be joining the Masked Hill group. Arashi, Isao Takagi, and Osamu Tashi Akari of the Dying War promotion debuted this week with Yoshiaki Yatsu's Social Pro Wrestling Federation. FMW's Miss Mongol Aki Kanbayashi is headed to Puerto Rico next month. Here and there. More on the Sunny NWA ECW WWF situation. As mentioned last week, Sunny Tamara Sitch canceled what was believed to have been a scheduled booking on February 21st for Dennis Coraluzzo to instead to the angle to lead to the pay-per-view where her and Chris Condito acted as if they were splitting up the same night for ECW television in Philadelphia. Since that time, Coraluzzo has written a letter to the WWF complaining about how the situation went down, as it turned into a disaster as the local sponsor bought the show largely because Sunny was promised, and has also threatened to sue. Coraluzzo also canceled Sunny's booking at the Eddie Gilbert Memorial Show on February 28 in Philadelphia, which Sunny was going to work free because it was a benefit show and do an arm wrestling gimmick with Marlena. At the NWA show, Coraluzzo did act for much of the night like Sunny would be there, even though he had been given the word one day ahead that she wasn't. And then when she didn't appear and the word got out that she was at ECW, there was tremendous heat on Coraluzzo, including the sponsor supposedly never wanting to deal with him again. According to sources close to Sunny, read that Chris Condito, she was given approved bookings by Jim Ross which included the NWA date. She never agreed, nor didn't agree, to the bookings but took blame for not following up on them until real late, at which point she decided against doing the date for a number of reasons, among them money and wanting to spend the time with Condito at the ECW show that night. She did the angle at ECW as a last-minute deal because the other angle, Sid, had fallen through. She was there and they did plan B. The WWF side of the story is that she had the date, decided to cancel the date only a few days ahead of time, claiming that there would be heat from ECW if she worked for Coraluzzo, and that Coraluzzo was wronged. They went to Paul Heyman, who then said he didn't pressure her not to work the date and that he didn't care if Sunny worked NWA and that there was no heat about her working for them in the past. We do know that Sunny was unhappy many weeks back working an NWA show and being asked to be part of a skit that ran down Sandman, since Sandman is a top name in the promotion her fiancé is assistant booker of. While WWF was aware and did approve of her doing the pay-per-view, they did not know of or approve of her doing the ECW TV angle to lead to the pay-per-view, and there was heat over that because they don't care if she shows up at ECW house shows but with anything she does that will appear on ECW television. The Gilbert show drew about 600 fans with Nick Bockwinkel and family members of Bobo Brazil, and the entire Gilbert family attending. There were hecklers as Coraluzzo spoke of Gilbert, since he ripped on ECW, and at Peggy Gilbert, Eddie's mother, who defended Coraluzzo as they said that Heyman had backstabbed his longtime friend Eddie to get the book in ECW and basically stole the promotion. There is a reality to this, and that is that Gilbert did bring Heyman into the ECW, and Heyman did take over as booker when Gilbert was removed, and that Heyman probably had a strong hand in that happening. However, ECW would have been dead many years ago had all that not happened, as they were swimming deeply in red ink, which was among many reasons why Todd Gordon and Gilbert split and Heyman took over. Sid Vicious beat King Kong Bundy. Vicious claimed he's gotten a bad rap, saying his no-show for the autograph show was because he was told to use his own frequent flyer miles to fly in, and that Ian Rotten told him not to come to the show last week because the advance was poor, but then buried him in the ring when he wasn't there. Brian Hildebrand was given an award for his longtime service in pro wrestling from former boss Jim Cornette. In the main event, Tommy and Doug Gilbert beat Dory Funk and Buddy Landel. Europe promoter Franz Schumann wrestled Dan Severn, and it was said to have been one of Severn's best pro matches to date, as Schumann was widely praised as being a good worker. In the February 9th issue, we had the wrong results of a new show in Baltimore on February 1st. Actual results are Glenn Osborne winning Battle Royal, Spaz and Slashby Switchblade and Lucifer, Bad Crew be Sweet Daddy Love and Sweet Georgie Love, Ramblin' Rich and Jimmy Janetti be Darkside Demons, Cat Burglar be Flex Wheeler, AC Golden 1 Battle Royal, Osborne be Golden, Rich and Janetti be Spaz and Slash, Danny Rose be Executioner, Pinky and Bodacious Pretty Boy be Morgus the Maniac and Mad Dog O'Malley, Bob Starr be AJ Fritzoid, Bad Crew be Rich and Janetti to win tag team titles. World Wrestling Alliance has afternoon and evening shows at the Rochester, New Hampshire Middle School on March 21st using George Steele and Sergeant Slaughter, and the night before with the same crew in Milford, Massachusetts at the National Guard Armory. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution on February 27th had a restaurant review of Abdullah the Butcher's House of Ribs and Chinese Food in Atlanta. They praised the ribs, but said the Chinese food was run-of-the-mill. The Portland Globe ran another feature on area indie wrestler Robbie Ellis, Rob Alowich, on the dichotomy of him being a weekend pro wrestler and also owning one of New England's top art galleries. Alowich actually has gotten a lot of pub over the last 10 years, including an item in Sports Illustrated years back. Ellis, who turns 55 in a few months and only weighs 170 pounds, is still working regularly on the Northeastern Indie circuit. For years, he tried to keep his weekend wrestling a secret from family and friends due to his real job and how people would look at him. Extremely Strange wrestling on March 7th at the Commotion in San Francisco using ring names like Natural Born Molester, Karen Von Erich, The Abortionist, Vampiro California, Tyson the Cannibal, Disco Dragon, and The Rapist. NHB. In the biggest NHB upset in recent memory, unknown Joel Gerson, a practitioner of survival jiu-jitsu, who was the 1996 Canadian Jiu-Jitsu champion, in his debut beat previously unbeaten Rumina Sato with an armbar submission in the first round in the main event of the March 1st Shudo card at Korakuen Hall. Sato, 11-1-1, was universally considered as the top under 170-pound fighter in the world in both NHB and also in combat wrestling, a Japanese sport similar to submission wrestling but awarding points heavily for aggression and pinfalls to avoid people resting on their back in the guard, and ranked in some circles as pound for pound the best. Extreme Challenge held a show on February 27th in Muncie, Indiana, which drew 3,000 fans with Dan Severn beating Kevin Rosier, a 300-pound former super heavyweight kickboxing champion with a 1-2 UFC record, in just 27 seconds. Severn charged Rosier, who actually wound up on top of Severn but didn't know what to do once he was there. Severn quickly reversed him and delivered 8 unanswered knees to the head before the match was stopped, elevating Severn's NHB record to 18-3-2. His next match will be April 4th in Guam, only 8 weeks shy of his 40th birthday, against unbeaten Pete Williams of Lions Den. Local wrestler Gary Myers won the main event over Nathan Allen and Jeremy Horn, who held Severn to one of his 2 career draws, the other being Chemo, won a 4-man tournament to improve his record to 9-2-2. Brad Kohler, who was in the December UFC and has been doing pro wrestling in Minnesota for Eddie Sharkey after being a nationally ranked Greco-Roman 220-pounder, lost to Hoist Gracie's student Joe Pardo in 143 with a knee bar to fall to 7-2. The Indiana Boxing Commission attended and said it was a very professional show. It is believed that Royler Gracie will face pro wrestler Yuhi Sano as part of the Pride 2 show on March 15th in Yokohama. KRS is also negotiating for Boss Ruden's NHB debut to be on its June 24th show, with Murakami Kazunari being suggested as his first opponent. And HBO are putting together a TV special called Tapping Out with Chemo and Vitor Belfort. The San Jose Mercury ran a short story on Frank Shamrock in the February 26th paper. To show just how mainstream WWF, let alone UFC, is nowadays, the story said that Shamrock learned submission wrestling from his father, Kevin Shamrock, a former UFC Superfight champion, The San Francisco Chronicle is scheduled to run a story on Shamrock on March 6. Several NHB names finished amongst the tops in wrestling's championship belt series sponsored by USA Wrestling. It has a point-scoring system based on wins in major events, giving greater credit for wins in bigger meets, and wrestlers of all different weight classes are competing against each other. Tom Erickson won the Freestyle Championship belt for the second year in a row. Townsend Saunders, who debuts on the March 13th UFC in the lightweight tournament, was ranked number 3, and Kevin Jackson was ranked number 7, both being the highest rankings within their respective weight classes. Randy Couture placed number 4 in the Greco-Roman division. ECW. ECW will get television back in Pittsburgh starting March 7 at 11 p.m. on WNPA, Channel 19. There had been heat with viewers' choice over ECW losing a key television market this close to the pay-per-view, since ECW has now tried to position itself in the cable industry as being no different than WWF and WCW as its argument for being on pay-per-view. They don't lose television stations, at least for that reason yet, while portraying itself outwardly as being altogether different. Stevie Richards will be undergoing throat surgery in 2 weeks, and is expected to need at least 3 more operations after that one. A ton of praise should be given to many of the wrestlers from ECW for the class they exhibited in regard to the death of Louis Spicolli when the other organizations largely ran from it. Aside from being pallbearers at the funeral, Sabu and his wife and Rob Van Dam and his girlfriend bought a large trophy and gave it to the Mucciolo family, proclaiming Spicolli an honorary ECW champion. Tommy Dreamer, Little Guido and Beulah flew across the country and had to fly back at 1 a.m. that night to be back for work to pay their respects. Paul Heyman allowed 2 of his biggest stars, Sabu and Van Dam, the night off for the funeral. There were people in the organization that Spicolli barely knew that went out of their way for the family more than superstars in other organizations that he knew a whole lot better. That was more than could be said on the whole for every other organization in this industry. The respect they showed on the weekend television was something all companies in this country should have, since he worked for all of them. Having the wrestlers use the Death Valley Driver on the pay-per-view as a way to pay their respects to him and rename the hold was something that, even if it meant nothing to anyone else or sounded corny to some, meant so much to his family and made them so happy, as if it were proof that he made a difference and was successful in what he loved and ultimately lost his life from the pitfalls of trying to fit into. It was well beyond any Call of Duty. The fact was that there were a lot of bitter feelings in life in regard to Spicolli and ECW for reasons that are well documented. For other organizations, it appeared Spicolli's death was more important for the fear a magnet for bad publicity than the passing away of someone who really badly wanted to fit in with them. That only speaks even higher for those in ECW for going out of their way. I can tell you from personal knowledge, even though nobody involved would ever say it publicly, but there are others who have buried loved ones in this profession who have been hurt greatly in their time of need because of the belief that when all was said and done, it appeared that while a lot of fans did, very few in the business their loved one devoted their life to seem to actually care. When all is said and done in this business, the real champions are those with their feet firmly on the ground, not those with their heads in the clouds, and when reality trespasses into fantasy, we find out who they really are. WCW. Nitro News from March 2nd in Philadelphia. Chris Benoit beat a waterlogged Scotty Riggs in 3:19 with a rolling German suplex. Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff came out to rag on Randy Savage. Juventud Guerrera sans mask pinned Chavo Guerrero Jr. with a 450 in 3:59. Real good wrestling. Crowd didn't care a bit. Prince Iaukea pinned Psychosis in 5 minutes. Decent. Result was mind-boggling. Raven pinned Disco Inferno with a DDT in 2:48. In a street fight, Public Enemy beat Hugh Morris and Barbarian in 3:12 when Rocco Rock splashed Morris through a table and pinned him. There were ECW chants when the first table was brought in. Otherwise nobody cared. The table looked a little gimmicked when they laid Morris on it and it already broke. Crowd booed the finish heavily because of that. Randy Savage did an interview and Sting came out to tease dissension for their main event. Crowd booed Sting. Bill Goldberg destroyed Sick Boy in 1:37 with a jackhammer. Match nearly fell apart when Sick Boy slipped on a springboard move. They showed a music video with Paige and the Flock. Ron Race, the 7'2", 360-pound former college basketball star from Santa Clara who trained under John Studd, was the clumsy-looking bleached blonde giant member of the Flock in the video. Paige beat everyone in the Flock up in the video and then in his interview acted like the music video was real life. You can't play that game in the 90s. Page beat Hammer via DQ in 140 when Raven interfered and Benoit made the save and they all fought each other. Davey Boy Smith beat Scott Norton via DQ. There is a pattern here. In 141 when Norton shoved the ref. Bulldog is trying to break DiMaggio's record for most consecutive horrible matches. Conan beats Super Colo with the Tequila Sunrise in 205. No matter how dead the crowd is, they always wake up when Colo does that bump off a clothesline. Conan did an interview to build up his match against Juvie Juice for the pay-per-view, although they announced a match with the two next week on Nitro as well. Ric Flair did an interview and Kurt Hennig and Rick Rude came out. Flair said he was Eric Lindros, the star of the Philadelphia Flyers, and Hennig was Jaromir Jagr, the star of the rival Pittsburgh Penguins. He kept telling the fans Hennig was Jagr so they'd care about Hennig. They told Flair that even though he saved Bret Hart, that Bret Hart wouldn't save him. Stevie Wonder could see what happened next. Actually, Hart's save was way late because they teased his name and destroyed Flair for a long time, with Hennig using the fisherman suplex on Flair and Rude counting the pin before Hart arrived. It was about the only angle on the show the crowd cared about. Scott Steiner beat Jim Duggan in 403 with a camel clutch, now called a Steiner recliner. Dean Malenko and Booker T beat Eddie Guerrero and Chris Jericho Hulk in 446 when Malenko made the Monday Night Jericho tap out. I'm really glad WCW doesn't believe in tag teams anymore, because if they did, Guerrero and Jericho would be the best team in this country by leaps and bounds. Jericho is basically doing the Love Machine stuff, and nobody knows how to work with that as a heel better than Guerrero. The NWO, this version being Kevin Nash, Scott Steiner, Conan, Marcus Bagwell and Dusty Rhodes, came out to present Rick Steiner with his official membership into the group. Steiner came out with Ted DiBiase, accepted the shirt turned on the NWO, which made perfect sense since there were 5 of them and one of him when he made his move and they beat his ass while Ted tried to figure out a way to avoid not looking stupid just standing there. Finally Nash was going to powerbomb the guy but he blocked it. Giant came out and powerbombed Nash to a huge pop. Giant was not arrested for this heinous crime and actually even came back out for the run-in after the main event. If this isn't unequal justice, I don't know what is. Somebody better call Johnny Cochran back, or at least Eddie Goldman, because I'm charging racism on this one. Bret Hart beat Bryan Adams via DQ when Hennig interfered as Hart had Adams in the sharpshooter in 431. Sting and Savage beat Hogan and Scott Hall in 729 when Sting had Hogan in the Scorpion and the NWO ran in for the DQ. Sound familiar yet? Ed Leslie showed back up as the disciple in the post-match and gave Savage what was supposed to be a stone-cold stunner, but actually was more like a diamond cutter because he blew the move so badly. I think when DX did that interview about Owen Hart and the Turd, it was actually a reprise of a behind-the-scenes promos people used to say about Ed Leslie. Disco Inferno was told no more stone-cold stunners as Hogan insisted the move be reserved for the newest NWO Parasite. Nothing to the rumors of Steven Regal being fired that made the rounds as actually the day he was supposedly fired. He was at a television taping. It is true that there were a lot of people mad at him for screwing around with the Goldberg experiment. Kevin Green signed back with the Carolina Panthers. He was at the Thunder a few weeks back in Birmingham and when he was talked with about wrestling, heard about the new schedule and said no way was he doing that. Thunder on February 26th in Cedar Rapids, Iowa drew a sellout 5,722, 5,309 paying $84,784. The show also did a 3.6 rating and 5.6 share. They announced the elimination of that long since antiquated over-the-top rope rule. Not sure if it was because WWF was making fun of it or simply because the announcers were having one hell of a time explaining why guys would throw each other over the top at will and no DQs were ever called. You know, they keep going over on their own momentum. Guerrero and Jericho beat Malenko and T when Guerrero frog splashed T in 10:15. Only an average match. Page did an interview to set up a title match against Raven next week. David Finlay pinned Brad Armstrong with the Tombstone Piledriver in 3:56. Bulldog pinned David Taylor with a power slam in 2:20. Goldberg pinned Rick Fuller with a jackhammer in 1:10. Yuji Nagata beat La Parka with a Nagata lock in 3:05. Scott Steiner pinned Marty Jannetty with a Frankensteiner off the top in 1:23. Hennig beat Jim Neidhart via DQ in 2:17 when Adams interfered and Bulldog made the save. I'm not sure which was worse, the match or the brawl after. And then in the Leave Your Brain at the Office match, Nash was DQ'd against Raven in a no DQ match for giving 2 power bombs to Lodi and getting arrested. Raven claimed it was under Raven's rules which now meant a battle royal. Nash destroyed the entire flock while Raven sat there. The deal only went 138. Finally, to end a disappointing show, Page went to a DDQ with Benoit in a U.S. title match when Raven attacked both men in 6:54. Probably the worst major match of Benoit's career. There was a near riot in Lincoln, Nebraska at the house show on February 27th. The crowd in the college town had been rowdy, throwing things all night. Jericho, who was wrestling Eddie Guerrero, figure that one out, started running down the Nebraska Cornhuskers football team with the same stuff they do for cheap heat every night. Well, the heat was expensive this time, and the crowd went totally out of control throwing things. Ringsiders were getting nailed with bottles and the security had to call in 30 backup police officers to quell things down. Several fans were injured. Guerrero had to play face and say he was going to give Jericho a Nebraska ass-whipping. Then when Curt Hennig came out for his main event against Ric Flair, he became human target practice until Flair said he was going to give him a Tom Osborne, Nebraska coach, ass-whipping. After the show, fans continued to throw things and people hit the ring. The building was said to have looked like a war zone by the end of the night, and WCW security said that it was the worst fan behavior ever for a WCW event. The two house shows this week were February 27th in Lincoln, drawing a sellout $6,082 and $126,900. Selling out the first day tickets were put on sale, and February 28th in Sioux City, Iowa, drawing a sellout $3,318 and $68,985. The shows were headlined by Flair pinning Hennig, Page beating Hall with a diamond cutter, and Jericho keeping the cruiser belt, beating Guerrero. Merchandise business for the week was $342,642, or an incredible $11.17 per head as an average for an entire week. With the Saturday night TV tapings on March 3rd in Johnstown, Pennsylvania also selling out to the tune of $3,990, paying $70,995, WCW is now working on an 8-show sellout streak. Randy Savage was on the NBC show later on March 3rd. Besides Ron Race, expect Mortis to join the flock. Brian Hildebrand's return as a ref was delayed a few days, although he was backstage in Philadelphia. The Pit Bulls were backstage trying to get a tryout but weren't given one. Big Dick Dudley was also backstage at the show. The feelings we were told regarding the APW wrestlers that got tryouts in Sacramento were that they were good wrestlers, but they wanted them to work on their physiques and would probably give them another look when they do Thunder in Oakland this summer. At the Cedar Rapids taping, there were actually a lot of people who saw the NWO Fear's Dan Gable poster that was on the air all night long in WCW that had no idea who Dan Gable was. WCW Saturday Night on February 27th drew a 2.7 rating. Scott Hudson in particular is getting a ton of praise from all corners for his work since hosting the show. There was a lot of heat on Lee Marshall's performance on The Last Thunder. WWF March 2nd, Raw in Cleveland opened with a DX interview challenging Tyson later in the show. Austin came out to confront them, but then Kane's music played and the lights went out. Kane never came out, but DX was gone when the lights came on. New Age Outlaws came out wearing neck braces with Road Dogg saying he had an excuse from Mrs. Horshack. That reference is almost outdated enough for Bobby Heenan to use. Sergeant Slaughter came out and ordered them to defend the belts against the world's most charismatic tag team, Skull and 8-Ball. This lasted all of 122 before Cactus Jack and Chainsaw Charlie came out of a garbage dumpster to chase them away for the count out. Mark Marrow pinned Tom Brandi with help from Luna, giving Brandi a low blow in 240. As Luna kissed Marrow, Goldust jumped him until Sable made the save. After Sable cleaned house with Takata kicks, Marrow yelled at her and she shoved him down and walked out again. Mark Henry beat Owen Hart via DQ in 5:37 when Chyna gave Henry a low blow in a European title match. The idea is that, with Hart trapped in the bear hug after Chyna first distracted Hart, was to make sure Hart retained the title for his match with Triple H at Mania. Hart and Henry was a bad match, but it was a lot better than you'd think. Headbangers and Taka Michinoku beat Rock and Roll Express and Barry Windham in 1:48 when Thrasher got the tennis racket and hit Robert Gibson with it. Next came the Tyson angle. After that, Steve Blackman beat Kama Mustafa in a dead match in 3:04 via DQ when Farouk and Rocky interfered and Ken Shamrock made the save. Then, in the acid flashback moment of the show, Robert Fuller Parker Welch came out doing his WCW Colonel Rob Parker gimmick and introduced Jeff Jarrett, doing his old Double J gimmick about being the world's greatest singer, etc. that he did when he came to the WWF years ago and later talked about how stupid it was. I'm still trying to figure out whether to laugh at him, laugh with him, or cry for him. Fuller's new managerial name is Tennessee Lee, a takeoff on famous country music promoter and former wrestler Buddy Lee, who died only a few weeks back. Jarrett beat Flash Funk with a figure 4 in 3:33. Oh, and the North American title simply vanished as well. The show ended with Kane and Uncle Paul coming out, Austin coming out and getting nailed by Michaels, Kane destroying a few plants, and the return of Undertaker. The house show started with some dark matches, with Brackus beating Recon in a terrible match, Jesus Castillo over Adam Copeland, Copeland said to look okay, Pierre Ouellet over Mike Drosy, CWA champion Marshall Duke Drosy, who was said to have looked horrible, but WWF does need someone to counteract those quarter hours when WCW puts Duggan on Nitro, and Miguel Perez pinned Sean Morley. For Shotgun, Bradshaw beat Mero when Goldust interfered, Flash Funk beat Goldust when Mero interfered, Farouk and Rocky beat T. Ranchula, not the many with the same name, and Brandy and Aguila pinned Brian Christopher. The house show ended with Austin and Charlie and Cactus over Outlaws and Helmsley. For March 4th in Wheeling, West Virginia, the card opened with dark matches as Vega beat Brackus, Morley beat Matt Hardy, Flash Funk beat Copeland, and Drosy pinned Paul Diamond, who got a tryout. For Raw, Blackman and Shamrock beat Rocky and Farouk via DQ. If you think WCW had a pattern on March 2nd, wait until you see WWF on March 9th. Wyndham beat Owen Hart via core in a European title match when Chyna gave Hart a low blow. Austin yelled at McMahon and tore the pockets out of his sports coat. Someone, may have been Blackman but not sure, beat Kama via DQ when the Nation of Domination interfered. Aguila beat Brian Christopher via DQ. Chainsaw and Cactus beat Quebecers not via DQ. They did a Kane interview and the lights went out, and when they went on, Undertaker was in the ring. And then the lights went out again, and he was gone. Bangers kept NWA belts, beating Rock and Roll via DQ, in a match with Luna and Sable handcuffed to their respective corners, Mero and C. Goldust, and afterwards the handcuffed Sable had her face painted up and had a drink thrown in her face. And finally Helmsley and C. Vega in 53 seconds when Austin and Michaels interfered, with Michaels again superkicking Austin and leaving him laying. Jesse Jam showed up with his arm in a sling, and the advertised main event on the card ended being Austin and Chainsaw and Cactus over Billy Gunn and Maivia and Helmsley in all of 30 seconds. Originally, the WrestleMania Cactus and Chainsaw vs. Outlaws title match was to be a barbed wire match. It fell apart when viewers' choice decreed objects like barbed wire and cheese graters, which were banned from ECW's pay-per-view as well, aren't allowed on pay-per-view. WWF used barbed wire on the February 15th pay-per-view and tried to say it was not planned, but then when it came out it was building to a barbed wire match. Well, it caused some heat. Undertaker is up to 310, from 285 when he left, pounds. The 1999 WrestleMania is tentatively scheduled from Sky Dome in Toronto. Jennifer Flowers' role in WrestleMania will be timekeeper for one of the matches. For WrestleMania, Aguila and Taka are going to have to choreograph their entire match, as Aguila is only experienced in doing trios matches and coming in for his high-flying spots, so he's totally inexperienced as far as wrestling a singles match. He's really not ready for this. Rumors that WWF had pulled out of Nassau Coliseum or that WCW had an exclusive on the building were false, as WWF has a date there April 14th for Raw and will be back on October 12th. Ed Cohen, WWF Vice President in charge of event booking, is recovering nicely from a tough bout with cancer. Farouk missed the weekend house shows with a hip injury. Legion of Doom were pulled from all the house shows for the storyline reason. Vader had his eye surgery on February 24th. Dory Funk will be in soon for another training camp. Among those at the new camp will be Paulo Silva, said to be 7'5" and 425 pounds, who played for Brazil's Olympic basketball team. He's 31 years old and had been living in New Jersey, and showed up at Larry Sharp's gym, and Sharp immediately showed him off to the WWF, which signed him to a developmental contract. Also at the camp will be Aaron O'Grady and Vic Grimes. House show business remained huge this week. February 26th in Tacoma drew $10,730 and $177,681. Those figures are not only another record gross for the city, but even more mind-boggling when you consider that Undertaker, Austin and Michaels were not only not on the show, but at no point ever advertised to be on the show. From the very start, the advertised main event was Shamrock vs. Maivia. February 27th in Vancouver, DC set city records for both attendance, with 15,458 and gate with $304,608, although most of the tickets for this show were told for a Shawn Michaels vs. Owen Hart main event. February 28 in Winnipeg drew $8,157 and $149,468, and March 1 in St. Paul drew $6,972 and $116,369. There are changes in how they are approaching the house shows. They are cutting the matches down in time and spending more time with crowd-baiting interviews. The undercard matches range from 2 minutes to 7 minutes, and the main event is supposed to go 10 minutes. Austin vs. Helmsley headlined Vancouver and St. Paul, and they did the 6-man with Outlaws and Chainsaw and Cactus added on in Winnipeg. In Vancouver, aside from the Record House, it was an unruly show with lots of fights in the stands. Fans were booing Kane's ring entrance in cities because they expect the elaborate fire they get on television. Maivia scored pins on Shamrock everywhere but in Tacoma, since they were the main event, so they did the face win due to outside interference DQ, which leads one to believe Shamrock is getting the IC title at Mania. One would think that would be about the time for the Farouk all-out split. Merchandise for the week was a whopping $604,390, which was $10.61 per head. Men's Teo Dick Togo and Shoichi Funaki from Michinoku Pro are close to signing deals. The new Midnight Express will debut in the Tag Team Battle Royal at WrestleMania. The WWF 900 line was disconnected and there were no plugs for it over the weekend. No idea why. Reckless Youth, contrary to reports here and elsewhere, has yet to be contacted by WWF regarding a tryout. He's also out of action due to a sprained hand. McMahon ripped on Ahmed Johnson both on the TSN TV show and also in an Ottawa Sun interview, basically saying he didn't know the difference between Ahmed Johnson and Tony Norris, that he was often injured, and that he also injured others. The truth is that both sides had been unhappy for a long time with their relationship. Johnson was put over so strong that he thought he was a bigger star than he really was. Most of his steam was killed both by bad booking and more by the fact he was always getting hurt, and that the more he was exposed, the more people realized what he wasn't. It's one thing to have a guy who can't work a lick but who can draw money. It's another to have a guy like that on the undercard with a long-term contract. Livewire on February 28 did a 1.7 rating and Superstars on March 1 did a 2.1. The readers' pages. Spicoli. Your piece on the Louis Spicoli death was pretty intense. It's scary not so much that the promotions haven't taken stronger measures to stop the problem, but that the wrestlers themselves see people in their profession drop dead like that, and most will probably not give a second thought to popping their next handful of pills. Through the past few months with everything that has gone on, I've been getting the sense that you're pretty much getting sick of some parts of the business, or at least of having the responsibility to dig in and report the real story, when all too often it makes you wonder why half these people are allowed to walk around free, let alone earning hundreds of thousands of dollars per year to have hissy fits about having to lay down for 3 seconds. Is the painkiller problem, or other drug problem for that matter, a problem in Japan? You hear all kinds of horror stories in the US, but you don't hear so much about the Japanese wrestlers. It is because such information is that much more difficult to come by, or are by and large. And I realize there are exceptions. The Japanese wrestlers generally better behaved. Why do WWF and WCW even bother having a lighter weight division if they are just doing to use the guys as jobbers for the heavyweights? They should distinguish the wrestlers between cruiserweights and heavyweights, and never should the two divisions meet. While that won't necessarily make any of the smaller wrestlers be taken any more seriously, at least we won't be seeing the best wrestlers in the world job for huge slugs and destroy whatever credibility and popularity they have the potential of having. Jim Raji. Atlanta, Georgia. Response from Dave Meltzer. I really don't know enough about that aspect of the business in Japan, but imagine just based on how brutal the style can be that painkillers aren't considered a foreign substance, and do know that steroids aren't foreign to wrestlers of that culture, although never to the degree they were popular here at their peak. There's a different culture there that is less tolerant of drugs, but Japanese wrestlers also emulate American wrestlers. There have been problems both from a legal and tragic situation with Americans over there, such as Steve Williams and Terry Gordy. I do know that if anything, the drug problems among wrestlers are probably worse in Mexico, again partially due to style and more due to the nature of the culture itself being more tolerant. Since there is no real precedent in this country in our generation of how to book a lighter weight division and get it over, both companies are feeling their way and really don't know how to do it. WCW has had some success just because of the awesome level of talent it has in that division, so the matches are so exciting it's done okay even without focused booking. WWF is failing because it's a company that did the division largely as a response to the success the other company had with it, and it's never been a priority, And it doesn't have the depth of talent and maybe doesn't have the receptive enough audience to make it fly, and it's really thrown out there on television more as an excuse to let Sonny strut out there and do ring announcing. But no matter how you slice it, that Barry Windham vs. Taka Michinoku fiasco was mind-boggling on every level. They couldn't work a good match due to style and ability clashes. It exposed just how short Taka really is when put in with someone who is deceptively tall, to people who may not have picked it up since Brian Christopher and his other foes are also really short. And the portrayal of the match killed whatever limited credibility Taka had and turned him basically into a comedy acrobatic midget performer. New Japan, which has booked junior heavyweights better and more successfully than any company in the world, learned that lesson early, and except for a rare gimmick such as when Liger worked spots in tags with Vader and Bigelow, who were all talented enough that they worked great spots together, or a tag match or two teaming with El Gigante because it looked cute and because the big guy already makes everyone else in the promotion look small anyway, like a tag team of Rey Mysterio Jr. and Giant would have looked at Giant not nix that program. They never book Liger and the crew in situations where it exposes their lack of size and thus kills their credibility. Always recall when New Japan very early in the Tiger Mask Sayama era booked him in a six-man against the Masked Superstar and Don Muraco, who were both 6'2" or 6'3" and huge men for their time, or a lot shorter than Windham, and in those days far more talented than Windham is today. And Sayama was taller than Taka, and even though they both bumped and sold for him, funny seeing Big Muraco fly around for his suplexes, and the match was very good for its time. It exposed Sayama's lack of size enough that New Japan never put Sayama in that kind of a situation again. And as far as overall popularity and impact, Sayama, booked in that manner, became the most valuable junior heavyweight performer in modern times and elevated the popularity of the division to where it has remained a fixture nearly 17 years later. Bret Hart. I'm still angry and bitter about the way Vince McMahon screwed Bret Hart at Survivor Series. Many people have tried to justify McMahon's actions. But would they be having to try so hard if what McMahon did wasn't so legally and morally wrong? It was McMahon who decided to breach Hart's contract, at a time when he was WWF champion no less. He couldn't afford Hart's contract? He doesn't seem to have a problem paying a convicted rapist like Mike Tyson millions of dollars to show up at WrestleMania. Tyson should be the one paying McMahon for trying to clean up his tarnished image. I don't think the WWF will benefit much from the Tyson deal. Well, it's time for Shawn Michaels to do another job, so it didn't come as much of a surprise to hear he's complaining of an injured back. Maybe the injury is legit, but at this point I don't even care. He has forfeited so many titles I've lost count. In nearly 14 years of working for the WWF, Hart always put guys over when it came time to drop titles. Because he refused to once time do a job for Michaels in Canada, people try to proclaim him the Antichrist. I was watching Raw the night of the Terry Funk Cactus Jack angle. Seeing the dumpster go off the stage with both guys inside lost most of its initial impact after they replayed it umpteen times. Nitro may have been a little boring that night, but it sure beat watching reruns of the same angle all night. Paula Brunson. Monroe, Louisiana. Response from Dave Meltzer. McMahon never publicly claimed and tried to paint the picture that he couldn't afford Hart's contract, just that he didn't think Hart was worth the money. The only person he painted the picture that he couldn't afford the contract to was Hart when he wanted the contract restructured, and then when he told Hart he was going to breach it. And he changed his tune on that 1 month later, although probably almost everything he said to Hart was probably a work. I love that word because it means lie but sounds so much more justifiable, like there's some noble motive attached to it, in one form or another, to get out of paying him for 20 years. Whether Tyson will end up being worth what he's getting or not, you can't compare the two deals. No matter how good a performer Hart may be, he would never garner the mainstream publicity worldwide that Tyson could. Tyson is getting paid to get people who aren't wrestling fans talking and interested in the WWF. Time will tell if it's successful. As far as Hart goes, it's really humorous to me to read people who act like the Hogan-Hart program will be a fiasco because neither will ever job for each other, or that Hart has problems doing jobs. Some people remember the actions of one day and ignore the circumstances involved and forget the first 20 years of his career when it comes to Hart. And when it comes to Hogan, they forget the entire last year and remember the first 20 years of his career. Whether the program will be a disappointment or not, and it may be, since Hogan is so limited and for Hart to look good he has to be in a good match, the problem isn't going to be two guys who refuse to put the other over, so we get nothing but bad finishes. Bret Hart and Davey Boy Smith are going to become very frustrated in WCW. WCW came up with that poor Steve McMichael challenge to introduce him. Just wait until Hart has to put Hogan over. If he put up such a fit about Shawn Michaels, wait until he has to work with Hogan. Speaking of Michaels, the fact he's already whining about doing the job for Austin lets everyone know how people like Hogan, Hart, Michaels, Nash, etc. run this business. Despite his critics, Vince McMahon made a star out of each and every one of these men. Although he does need talent now, his company does have the power to make stars. The lack of booking logic in the WWF is hard to figure out with Austin teaming with Owen Hart. It's like Rey Mysterio Jr. and Juventud Guerrera. Are they rivals or tag team partners? The cruiserweight division in WCW is a joke with all the title switches. I understand the idea is to get over that anyone can beat anyone, but the division would mean a lot more if it was more stable. Chris Chino. Jeffersonville, Indiana. Ever since the double cross, we've waited to see who ended up being the most screwed. The answer is obvious. Davey Boy Smith. Everyone else has benefited. Vince McMahon used it as a new storyline and freed up money to sign Mike Tyson, who for better or for worse, brings more publicity to the WWF than 100 years of excellence of execution. Bret Hart got a raise, a lighter work schedule and Hollywood connections. Eric Bischoff got another opportunity to gloat over on Vince McMahon. Shawn Michaels narrowed the number of people he'd someday have to lay down for by one. Owen Hart got a major raise, a huge push and a moniker of being the real Hart for the first time ever. And Davey Boy gets a program with Steve McMichael. Less than a year ago, he held 2 of the WWF's 5 belts. When he left the WWF, he was part of arguably the most overheeled contingency in wrestling. Now he's well, you know. Thanks for the Sandman Sabu pay-per-view review. When I got around to seeing it, I was expecting such a miserable eyesore of a match. The expectations I might have had otherwise going into it were gone and I was able to enjoy it much more. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, but I can't see what exactly it was about that match that touched such a sore spot with you. A dud match. Maybe. But there haven't been 3 pay-per-view shows over the last 3 years with at least one match just as bad or worse. Worst match of the decade? Come on. Michael Roper. Oakland Park, Florida. Response from Dave Meltzer. The freed up money line doesn't make sense. This isn't a store where you are selling pencils and you figure at the beginning of the year you're going to sell $3 million worth of pencils and have to budget accordingly. This is an entertainment business. In entertainment, you have fixed costs of doing business such as travel, renting building, etc. Among the things that fall into the category of fixed costs is undercard talent. Headline talent that draws is a totally different category. It's like the WCW wrestlers who want to see Hogan gone because that would free up $5 million for them to split, not realizing that Hogan pays his way and it actually doesn't free up one dime for anyone. Hart more than paid his salary last year in the WWF. Whether he would have this year is something nobody can prove one way or another. Even though business actually has picked up since he left, which has to do more with business patterns and Austin returning to a more active schedule, his leaving didn't free up one dime for Tyson even though the people running WWF, if they don't understand this concept, some may actually believe it did as well, and there may be the possibility those not understanding the drawing power of a headliner actually would want to cut a high salary in order to make up for the price they expected to need to get Tyson. Similarly, if signing Tyson at whatever price was a good business move, and WWF must have thought so to do it, if they hadn't signed Tyson, that wouldn't have meant they freed up money for the rest of the guys, as if it was good business. Tyson, like any headliner, should bring in more revenue than they are costing. Much as I like Steve Austin, am I the only one who thinks it's insane to put the world title on a man warned by doctors that he's wrestling with the threat of paralysis? Are promoters so convinced that we all have memory problems? Vince McMahon should shut up about the whole Bret Hart thing. Him talking about it again just made him look worse. His revisionist smear tactics on Off the Record were just plain creepy. Hart's story always stays the same. McMahon's version changes every time he opens his mouth. Guess which one comes across as if he's lying? And when he keeps reiterating that line about nobly taking that punch from Hart, it makes him sound like he's an idiot. McMahon wanted to mix things up by changing Hart's character against his will? What, make him a bigger star by turning him into Colonel De Beers? One letter wrote about Hart showing his true colors in tampering with Owen's contract. Aside from McMahon's accusations, what proof is there that Bret ever tampered with Owen's contract aside from suggesting Owen find a way out of it? Stephen Grant. Redmond, Washington. Response from Dave Meltzer. From the start it was always acknowledged by all parties that due to the way the contract was written since Owen Hart signed his contract without getting a lawyer to look over it, that he had 2 choices, sit out for almost 4 years, or return to the WWF. The former wasn't going to happen, so the only thing that could happen did happen. There was no way out of the contract unless McMahon was going to release him, and he wasn't going to do so. I have little doubt had Bret had his way that Owen would have joined him in WCW, but it was never considered a realistic possibility by anyone. Bret did express his feelings to Owen, feelings that were apparently shared by most of his family, that he thought it would be in bad taste to work an angle upon his return to WWF based on the Montreal finish. Of course, the Starrcade finish was based on the Montreal finish. The idea was for Owen to return and work a major program with Michaels based on the finish in Montreal. That program never materialized as it turned out anyway because WWF quickly changed direction of Hart's program to an issue with Helmsley, so McMahon threatened Hart with a lawsuit for getting in the way of a proposed program that he voluntarily didn't do to begin with. This is the end of this program. Thank you for watching. See you next time.